Well, there's the news we were all waiting for. Classic Fresh has been, well, it was already announced, but it's been fleshed out a little bit, hasn't it? With some news that dropped while I was sleeping. And it's always lovely to have one of those days where I get to wake up to, many pings and a bunch of messages on the Discord going, Josh, get the fuck up. And then I wake up at about 7 o'clock and I'm like, oh man, something's obviously happened. And it was the news I was waiting for. So I'm really, really happy about that. Granted though, it was, a different twist on Classic Fresh that I was expecting, as many of you were, so I was not shocked in the slightest by what I saw, but there's a lot of, conversation to be had about the selections that were made with the direction of Classic Fresh, and that's why we've got a couple of guests here that I'm really happy to have with me. You all know them, you all love them from shows prior. I'm so happy to have back here Duranasaur. Mate, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure, mate. I love speaking with you. You are the epitome of chill, and so I love just sort of leaning back and then hearing your thoughts on things. And joining Duranasaur, we've got I go through like withdrawals the longer I go without talking to this person. I start to like twitch. I start to cry in the corner, and I'm so happy that they're here to give me my fix. North, mate, what's going on?
It's been far too long. It really has. I've been itching to get back on a call. I can feel the buzz in my veins.
Very good, very good. And that's not just the drugs, so it's great. All right, guys, let's get stuck into it. And for everyone, hearing this on the podcast, this is going out to the people listening live on Twitch. This is a town hall, so you might hear some other voices drop in during the call. This is very much so a community chat where I invite people to come in and have their say. If they agree or disagree with anything that the three of us say, you guys are more than welcome. I'll keep dropping the link in the Twitch chat while this is going on. I'm not even going to try and put a time limit on this one. We'll just see how long we go for. If North or Duranasaur need to go at some point, if something comes up, guys, you're more than free to say, Josh, I gotta go. It's not going to hurt my feelings. But let's get started. This could be a bit of a doozy. Look, before we go into the specifics, one thing I would like to tackle is just the concept of fresh in general. I was seeing, and guys, I've been thinking about Classic Fresh way too much over the last 6 weeks. Like, it has dominated my thoughts. I'm constantly reading. I'm reading hours of shit on Reddit. I'm watching all the old videos. I'm so excited. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, what kind of, meta of my own I might want to design and get outside the box a little bit. But the thing is, it's been at the forefront of my mind. The one thing that I've noticed on, Reddit in particular, and people might say, well, that's Reddit for you, is that there definitely has been some dissent in general just to the overall concept of Classic Fresh. People are saying, why? Why the fuck would you idiots want Classic Fresh? What is going on? Like, we just did that. Is something wrong with you? And I never really understood that take because I somewhat drew a parallel, not exactly a direct parallel, but before Classic came out, we had a lot of naysayers, a lot of people playing retail going, why the fuck do you want Classic? This is so fucking stupid. Like, hey, sometimes people have different likes and interests. And, Classic Fresh was one of those for me. And it's a bold take for me to kind of step up to the plate and say, don't make a game for someone. But that seemed to be happening. I understood some of the arguments behind the points, but I didn't agree with them. So I'll open it to you guys. North, I might start with you. Had you seen this dissent for Classic Fresh around the traps, and what's your take on it?
So I think it relates to really why, and I have seen it, I think it relates to why people often like to play games. And I think that it kind of speaks to where their avenues of enjoyment sort of lie. And I think that's because a lot of people rely on novelty in their experiences in games and experiences in life. And so when something is new, when something is different, that's what interests them. So Classic coming around for, right, like the first time around when it's reintroduced, it's new to them, right? There's new metas to discover. There's new things to, right, like, to reveal. We have, all these mechanics that we weren't aware of and all this new stuff to discover. They might not enjoy the game itself. They might not enjoy the leveling itself, the raids themselves, the mechanics. They might just enjoy, right, the novelty of it. And I think a lot of people do enjoy novelty in games because you'll talk about, for a lot of people, the nostalgia of certain things isn't, oh, it was, when I was laid up at night with the boys in Discord. No, it was, when I saw Ironforge for the first time, when I got my first mount, when I the first, everything's a first, right? And I think that's that novelty speaking for them. When they say, oh, well, why would you want to do it again? We already just did it. It's fresh in my mind. I don't enjoy the mechanics. I enjoy the novelty. It's not new. I would prefer going into Wrath. I would prefer going back into Kata, because those things we're going to discover new things. And I think that's in twofold wrong. First, one, I don't think novelty should drive why people like games. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong for trying to judge how people enjoy things. But two, I think that there is novelty in reintroduction, so long as some mechanics are changed. And we're seeing that with the announcement. We're seeing that some things are going to be changed. The metas are going to shift. And so there is freshness to that. And so long as the mechanics themselves are enjoyable, the atmosphere, the palette, the canvas, let's say, of vanilla, which is why I think vanilla is strong. The canvas of vanilla is strong enough to, support these changes. I think that they should be willing and open-minded in trying it, because it is so much fun, right? The fresh experience is so much fun. Even I'll shit on New World left and right, but the fresh experience, really, in any game, doesn't matter how bad it is going to be fun, because there's new stuff. There you have that novelty, and it'll shine over the mechanics, but right? Like it's about the social experience, I think. So a little bit long, but
no. Very well said. I love it. Now, Duranasaur, I'll throw it to you, mate, because, despite the fact that you are not necessarily overall happy with the delivery system that Blizzard has announced for Classic Fresh, and we'll get into all that, and I'm so glad you're here to provide that contrarian view. But before we get to that stage, overall, I'm presuming you were very excited for Classic Fresh, and I'd ask you the same question I put to North, where, had you seen this sort of like naysaying and dissent for Classic Fresh lovers, and what was your take on people saying, why the fuck would Blizzard want to do this for people?
Yeah, I've seen him, and I probably share a very similar opinion to both you and North, where I have been excited about Classic Fresh. I was one of those people who played private servers and jumped on the bandwagon for every fresh one, because that fresh experience is a very unique one, and it's very fun and challenging, not just the initial launch or the initial race to, clear your first raid, but just the whole process of starting anew and building another character from scratch. And I think that all the naysayers, they come from this perspective of, okay, I've been there, I've done that. Like, it's done, it's over, I completed it. And that's how they sort of view World of Warcraft. And I think that's been built into the game itself when you look at the way that they have done different expansions, right? Every expansion sort of just makes the previous one null and void. So it's built into the average WoW player's mind that, oh, once I finish whatever iteration I'm playing, like, it's done, it's gone, and we're moving on to the next thing. But I think what a lot of us learned, maybe we learned from private servers, or maybe it's something that we, got from playing other video games, because even Blizzard themselves, they have games that are seasonal. If you look at like Diablo 2, where there's a lot of evidence that replayability is important and it's something that people want to do. And so I think that it's going to depend on the person, absolutely, whether or not they actually enjoy a fresh launch and a fresh start, especially with World of Warcraft, a game that's so big and so vast and takes such a time commitment. But for any, I don't know, the people out there that are naysayers against it, my thought would just be, they don't need to play, and maybe this isn't necessarily for them then. Maybe this is for a different kind of player that is interested in playing this version of the game, multiple times over, because they just enjoy it from day one through, farming Naxxramas.
It's an interesting thing where, and both of you guys feel free to chime in on this one once I'm done, but it's an interesting thing for me where a lot of and I know this is a bit of a meme, and fuckwits are going to be fuckwits online, but one of the common lines that you would see obviously would be like, these fresh servers will be dead after a month. This is going to be a fucking joke. But as you just said, Duranasaur, like, I completely agree with you that if anything, we've already had it firmly established in, as a somewhat of a gaming, not concept. I'm trying to think of a better word, but, tenant, if you will, that like there is an audience for long haul seasonal play, and Path of Exile definitely helped pave the way for that, where like, here's a game that does present, 100+ hour journey to cap or whatever, and people are signing up for the experience over and over again, reroll. So it's not like that concept in and of itself is something that scares gamers. There's a massive truck drives by me. Thanks for that. But, it's something where, I just think that there is an audience for this, and it won't be a dead server, because people might be using the TBC thing to say, we're all playing TBC. Of course those servers are going to die. People just see it as a 1-month novelty and then go back to TBC or elsewhere. Whereas I feel that there's enough of an audience that isn't necessarily either, number one, playing TBC, or number two, fully invested in TBC, that would be more interested in Classic as opposed to TBC, that would keep these servers afloat over the 12-month existence. Do you guys agree with me or disagree with me?
I would personally, I would, of course agree. And I think part of the problem is, like even my guild has been talking about it, right? Even if Fresh launched next week, we would all go play Classic, but we'd keep playing TBC because TBC, in terms of the commitment, right, that most players are putting into it, it's either arena or raids, right? And the raids take 2-3 hours a week for us, right? And so for other guilds, it might take longer, right? But when the content is on farm, there's not that much to do in TBC, and I think that's part of the problem. I mean, it's something that, I've been on the show a bunch of times, and I've talked about why I prefer vanilla to TBC, because ultimately, right, even if the PvE experience in TBC, I think, is vastly superior, the world experience in vanilla completely trumps it. And that experience is kind of like itself like a Fresh, because that experience it's recyclable. It's sustainable, right? You can go out, right, if the content, especially if the content's harder. On Classic, not so much, right? Like on Classic the first time around, but if they take away world buffs like they're doing, if they make the content a little bit harder, things like elemental fire for resist pots, right? You're going to need to go farm those because those are going to be absurdly expensive because people are going to need it to kill the content, right? Things like shadow resist pots on Nefarian or Cthulhu, or nature resist pots on Cthulhu are going to be enormously expensive. So these things start to go up, right? And so you push people back out from in these farms, especially if you break the mage farms, you push people back out into the world. And that's really, I think that's where the world, right? World in the name, World of Warcraft really shines, is out in the world, because I think it's a better social canvas for the game when people aren't just AFK and chat trap.
Very good. Durana, anything on that, or shall we move on?
I definitely agree in terms of the differences between the two games. And that's honestly one of the reasons, that I think vanilla shines, that people don't want to admit, is that the farming of consumables and resources and things in vanilla that most people probably think back on as like a time sink rather than a positive thing. Like, I think it does amount to an overall positive experience because it's a reason to log in. And once you've logged into the game and you're actually actively moving around in the world, you're going to find other stuff to do. You're going to be talking with people in guild chat. You might get on Discord. Like, it turns into a much broader experience than just, I have to farm more stuff.
It sucks you into the social experiment, right? That is World of Warcraft. And that's what MMOs are so much worse than, every other genre in almost every single way, because those genres do things better, right? Like MOBAs and FPSs, right? They're better expressions of skill. RPGs are better expressions of character, but the best thing that MMOs have to offer is the expression of player-driven experience. And the only way you get that is when people are out in the world interacting with each other. And that's why vanilla is so great. Chef's kiss.
All right. Keep it in your pants. We'll get there. Look, and you actually raised a point about gold that I'd please remind me, guys, to come back to when we're in the thick of things, because I've got a very, very small thought on the economy and, gold buying and players' draw to gold in the prism of a 12-month server that I do want to discuss. But look, before we get there, let's sort of start going through the news and talking about what we got told. As I said, guys, if you were shocked by the fact that Classic Fresh has changes to this extent, I would sort of say maybe, as the famous film quote goes, you haven't been paying attention. Thanks so much for the host, Pastor Dave. I really appreciate that. How are you, mate? Now, it's the extent of the changes that everyone was sort of sitting around with trepidation about. How far will they go? Will they really swing for the fences or keep things somewhat conservative? I've got a relatively hot take on this in that, like, I think the changes they've made, I actually quantify them in my mind as conservative, when so many other people I completely accept would think this is them swinging for the fences. I really disagree. I think, look, I'm happy. I'm not going to turn this into a negative spin, guys, but please don't think I'm not being positive when I say this, but like, Blizzard did actually do the bare minimum in terms of they really did the safe flip on Classic Fresh, if you know what I mean. This was going to ruffle the fewest amount of feathers in my mind. Now, North, you hear me and you are nodding along. Tell me what you think of that.
Well, I think with the exception of the world buffs change, I think a lot of the sweatier people are really, because, it's mostly a warrior thing, right? They're upset because the class plays differently, right? It fundamentally plays differently without world buffs. That being said, every other change is incredibly conservative and things that like are sort of universally, and I say that very confidently, universally desired by the community. More herb spawns, right?
Yeah.
More node spawns out in the world. We got that blue post. They're trying to break mage, right? Like mage leveling. There's, some splits in terms of the XP stuff, but the XP stuff is so minor. They're saying, oh, TBC era kind of stuff, but they're not even reducing the XP cap according to what we know. They're not reducing the XP values. They're not changing mount levels. They're going to increase quest XP. If that's all they're doing, right, it fundamentally changes so little, and it's such an inoffensive change to the vast majority of people. World buffs upsets the hardcore raiders, for sure.
We'll get into,
it's such a small minority of people, and I don't think it's a legitimate thing to be upset about, because now it creates other metas. And I was talking with about this with other people. It creates a meta where maybe you use world buffs to go into your Arathi Basin pre-made, or your Warsong Gulch pre-made. Maybe that's the new meta. Maybe you drop this Onyxia head. Okay, it's not for Molten Core anymore. It's for when you go to Azure Ghosts. And you've got this 40-man raid, maybe this 80-man raid, maybe this 120-person raid, right? Strapping up their boots, right? Getting their mounts ready for combat in the front of Stormwind right before going out into battle, and they drop an Onyxia head. And so that rallying cry is in front of the whole server, right? And 100 plus players going out to ride together, Riders of Rohan style into the fray, like nothing for me. That's such a better, right? Like world buffs, it's in the name. And this is, it's so on the nose. It's in the name. They're better in the world. And we don't use them in the world because they're so important in instances. It just encourages so much better gameplay, I think, and dynamics.
We'll definitely get into the specifics of all the changes. I find it interesting, what you said about the world buffs change, though, in terms of you think that is them kind of, stepping out a little bit. I personally tag that one as conservative as well, which is a controversial thing to say. I get that. The reason I say it is because I think there was safety behind the choice because of the sheer amount of voices that were saying they wanted it. So I felt like Blizzard felt more comfortable flipping the switch on this one because they would get the least amount of blowback. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that absolutely wanted world buffs in Classic Fresh, but I feel like there were more that didn't want them. So they made an A or B choice and went with the majority on that one.
I think it's the most controversial thing that they're doing. I don't think that it's controversial in any sense, but in a very minor sense maybe, but I don't think that it's, overtly controversial. I think the only issue that I would potentially pick with that is, in terms of fresh audiences, I think it does appeal to the more hardcore players more readily. Generally speaking, I'm curious what you and Duranasaur think about that. And so because it sort of is piqued to the interest of the more hardcore players, I think that it is maybe the most controversial thing because, right, the more hardcore players tending to the fresh and the more hardcore players tending sometimes against this change.
I'll have a big point about that. I'll throw it to Duranasaur, but I'll have a big point about that later on, well, very soon when we start to talk about the cadence of the server. Because whilst I agree that Classic Fresh does seem to, generally appeal to the more hardcore player, Blizzard also has to very delicately balance the appeal to the casual player as well. And they've obviously done things with this server to be able to try to get the best of both worlds because, look, we can do the Blizzard bashing thing, but they've got to maximize profit, and they can't lock players out by basically saying, if you're not hardcore, this server isn't for you, to a certain extent. But we'll get there really soon. Duranasaur, let me throw the same question to you, mate, and just ask: do you feel that overall the changes that we got with this one were quite ostentatious, outrageous, outlandish, or do you think they were conservative?
I mean, I think on the spectrum, the most like outlandish thing they could have done would have been like a full on like Classic Plus thing. I'm thinking of like Ascension or like Turtle WoW or something where they like fundamentally changed the game, and they obviously didn't do that, right? A lot of the things are maintained, and I think that you hit it on the head. Like the World Buffs one, I think most people could have guessed that one. I think a lot of people were hoping for some adjustments to the raids to make them a bit more difficult. And then the faster leveling, I think that goes with them wanting to appeal to the broader community, to the average Joe.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I don't think anything in here is was too risky on their part. I think it was fairly in check, I guess, with, and as far as like they could have gone, like, yes, they could have done way more than they actually did. Now, does that mean that, it's good stuff? I don't think so. But we can get into that.
Yeah. And just to piggyback one last point on this, I feel like if people were to ask, well, Josh, if you don't think these are controversial, then what would you term as controversial? That is more what Duranasaur was just alluding to, where, they had the option, perhaps, I don't know, they might say it wasn't possible, but you have options out there that private servers follow, things like, well, and this is, I'm not going to lie, guys, you can call me a fuckwit, but these are things that I was secretly hoping for. I've been king of the Classic Plus will never happen mountain. I just think you're delusional if you do think that new content is being made for this game at any stage. However, my definition of Classic Plus was more working within what they have, the tools that they have. So like, things like, what if they brought TBC builds to the vanilla world and we got like, not all of it. I don't mean the whole talent tree or anything, but like I was saying more like mechanical stuff. Like what if Paladins got their taunt in vanilla? What if,
you're digging into my notes, Josh.
What if Shadow Priests got their issues sorted out in vanilla? What if, Boomkins got their issues sorted out in vanilla? Just things that kind of might fall within the original philosophy of the game, of things that they didn't have time for, that we've heard Kevin sort of say in the past, that unfortunately were left by the wayside. That, it's not necessarily a point where you transplant TBC into vanilla, but some core mechanics that would go with a class might come along, and things like higher difficulty and things like that. That was my definition of Classic Plus that I was secretly hoping for, but obviously we didn't get that. But this particular rollout of Classic Fresh, look, it might be a fucking proof of concept. This might be a thought experiment that, if it plays out to be popular, paves the way for that kind of stuff in the future in other seasons. We shall see. North, sorry mate, sounded like you want to say one last thing on that.
No, I mean, the Paladin song's taken straight. Like, I for the first time ever, I've brought notes to the show, and the Paladin song is something that I actually really would have liked to see, because I think like those kind of like small adjustments, and we can get into them later, I think would be very, very strong. And I think that even in the branding, I think you're on the money. I think that even in the branding, they're calling it seasonal. They weren't calling it a refresh. They weren't calling it fresh. They weren't calling it a reintroduction. They named it seasonal. This is a thought experiment. If it works, it works. And they're going to want to expand on that. And then maybe eventually we get that classic plus, the daring changes that would make the game fundamentally different. For now, we're going to get a couple. And I think they're good changes for the most part. And hopefully we get more, right? Like I really want to, in this testing phase, I am going to be vocal on the forums. I'm going to be vocal everywhere that I can be, that we want more, right? Because I think that I think you're right? They're doing the bare minimum here. They want proof of concept, but I think that they could dare to dream a little bigger, if you will.
I love it. Tom Hardy, eat your fucking heart out. Mate, you being vocal, that doesn't sound like you. What have you done with my friend North?
Finally, the hashtag Some Changes crew is won. After all this time, my hashtag will rise from the ashes.
Very good.
Team Elevator next. Team Elevator is going to be next.
Yeah, well, you've got some fans in Twitch chat already. Someone shouted out your elevator idea earlier, and now you've got another person cheering you on, saying North is so on point today. Well, look, guys, plenty more of North to come. We'll get into it. Look, let's really start. I've fluffed you up enough as it is, so to speak.
True.
And North's raging and ready to go. So, let's get into the specifics. And I think the best point to start with, is this 12-month cadence. Because I've already said, and fuck off everyone. I've coined the fucking phrase, trademark, all that shit, printing shirts as we speak. I'm really not, but vanilla is not classic, is not fresh. These are all incredibly different entities, as North just shouted out to as well. And so I think that we have to put ourselves in a different frame of mind for every single one of these things. With the 12-month cadence, to me, and obviously a lot of you are probably going to feel the same way, I would describe that as an absolute lightning pace for a WoW Classic server. It is just, talk about, the greased up road that we're just flying down. 2 months per phase, give or take a week or so. 6 phases, same rollout effectively that we got, through Classic, with the huge, exception. They learnt their lesson that Battlegrounds will come from the get-go as opposed to later on. A lot of people would be breathing a huge sigh of relief with that one. So if you are rolling on a PvP server, which, spoiler alert, I will not be, but we'll get into that later. That's a bit of a comfort for you that you can go jump in a battleground rather than being fodder in the open world necessarily. But just on the 12 months, I think this is brilliant personally. And I'm happy, as I said, Duranasaur might very much so disagree with a lot of these points as he's already, foreshadowed. But, I think it's wonderful because we just did 2 years of Classic, 2 years, and we loved it. We had a great time. I think any kind of cadence over that 12-month mark really starts to encroach a bit too much on a lengthy period of time with Classic again. I just don't think people want 2 years of Classic again when we just did 2 years. The proximity in time is so close. It's a little bit, it might be a little bit much for some people. But this get in, get out, wham bam, thank you ma'am feel to Classic Fresh, I personally love it. And we'll get into the leveling rates and everything soon, but just on the 12 months North, what do you think?
I think it's brilliant. I think abbreviated phases is right, is really what people want. I think a lot of the problem with Classic is that you had, you had old content invalidated very quickly because people were sitting full bits. Not everyone, right? And this is going to create some contention in terms of the amount of gear that you'll need, and the amount of, just in terms of the cadence, right? Things will be different for sure. But I think that's a welcome change, right? I really liked the abbreviated timeline on Northdale, which was prior to Classic's launch, right? Because of how fast it was. It was much faster than previous servers, in part because we were expecting Classic so soon, right? And because of that, right, I think that the phases were much faster, right? Content was much, it was much more visceral as a result, right? And with this removal of world buffs, it makes things much harder for much longer, right? You have less gear. You have access to less gear per phase, right? So everything is things matter more, I think, when there's an abbreviated timeline and there's just more to do in a short amount of time because, right, the content's already there. All they have to do is press the button. Why not give it to us faster? Why be waiting months and months and months for this kind of thing when we don't need to and when ultimately it's going to be a better experience?
Okay. Joanna, I'll throw it to you. Now, look, we'll bleed into the leveling rates conversation straight after this one, and by all means, you might have to segue into it in the point that you're about to raise. But let me ask you and just let you sort of go nuts. What do you think of the 12-month cadence?
I think that I think it will do what you guys are saying. I think that it will put a lot more emphasis on every little thing. Like every raid lockout is going to mean more. The older raids are going to be more substantial and they're going to mean more longer. I don't know if that's necessarily, like, depending on the player, I don't know if that's a good thing. I think that it's too fast. I think that it's going to actually do the opposite of what I think all of these changes are doing, which is placate the average player, right? Because I think that so much of what we're looking at here, and maybe this sort of like feeds into the leveling rates, like you said, but there are so many people, I think, that are, the average Joe that, didn't get the opportunity to, do all the things that they want in Classic, whether it's all the raids, whether it's PvP ranking, whether it's get their legendary, whatever it is. And the chance of them being able to come back and do this in Fresh is basically like halved, right? And maybe even less so. So you're not appealing to those people anymore, which I don't really care because that's not the people that I'm trying to appeal to. For me, this is too fast because it just takes away, I think, important aspects of the game that come from being able to farm content for a long time and then create your own means of, I guess, enjoying it, right? And so for me, that's like talking about speedrunning, specifically raid speedrunning. And when you limit the content to these very short time periods, you're basically saying that there's not going to be enough time for any speedrunning to really exist per phase, which is how it was in the original Classic release, right? Everyone was fighting to get that top Molten Core time until BWL came out. And as soon as BWL came out, there was no reason to speedrun Molten Core. And when you cut these phases down to be as short as they are, then there's not enough time, one, to actually like dive into and see what speedrunning is like, especially with a new no world buff meta. But then there's also not enough time to get the gear to even theoretically compete with the previous speedrun times from like older, I guess first season of Classic Vanilla, whatever you call it. So for me, there are certainly benefits to it, but I think that it's taking away the player's ability to like make content for themselves, and to like enjoy the long haul of the game.
I'm not trying to be a dick, mate. I'm genuinely interested in what your thought is on this, though, because I hear what you're saying. And obviously you're deeply entrenched in the speedrun community and you've got that great website for TBC up and running. That people can, go and get invested in a speedrun community and try and push with content that we know. But I'm curious as to the creation of new possibilities with speedruns and things like that. And doesn't the thought of like an alternate universe where we now create different times and different challenges titillate you a little bit? Or is it, no, I want to run in what I know?
I mean, it might, cause it's, the idea of it in the hypothetical, sure, could be great. But one of the things that I was very excited about for Classic Fresh, even before the whole road to rag with the hardcore community. I was thinking about trying to find a guild that was specifically going to try to beat the records from, original Classic Vanilla, like what we just went through, right? They were going to look at and see, hey, by the end of phase 2, this was the fastest Molten Core speed time. Our goal is to beat that. And then to do the same thing come the next phases, come BWL, AQ40 next, because those marks were set. And if they release the same version of the game, that means that we have the opportunity to try to best those times and to just push the boundaries of the game that much further. And what we're getting, the changes that we're getting, basically null and void all that. So everything that was done in Classic is now, ironically, locked away and gone forever, which is exactly what we kind of felt like we got the first time around when Vanilla came out. And then we moved into next expansions. It was like, oh, we never get to play that version of the game again. Now I feel like, oh, I never get to play my version of Classic WoW again.
Well, I know what you're saying. I guess the obvious response, even though it's one that comes loaded with a bunch of caveats, is the Classic era servers are right there for anyone that does want to play that version of the game. Obviously, those servers have, beyond disgusting population issues. So that's another thing in and of itself. But I know what you're saying, and I'm certainly not someone, I'm not going to sit here and be like, if Blizzard were to have, and quite frankly, I think as we all say they should always have that option of people being able to play the game in its original state, as they do now, but just, it's not fresh, and so people aren't being driven there, and so I get where you're coming from. But we might as well segue into the leveling rate conversation now, because I feel like it kind of has to go hand in hand with this cadence of the server. And we'll definitely come back to more on what you've got to say in terms of like the hardcore leveling and everything, Duranasaur. But we've been told that we're getting effectively the TBC take on the leveling experience, which is, by all estimations, whatever, about 30% quicker of a leveling experience from 1 to 60. And it starts to get quicker from level 20 onwards. I think 1 to 20 is the same. But, as North said, more experience from quests, thus smoothing things out and making everything just that little bit quicker for people. I am of the belief that as soon as they decided that this 12-month cadence was going to be the thing, everything in relation to timing had to be reevaluated. This goes beyond the leveling experience as well. This is obviously leveling rates first and foremost, but then we have to start looking at other things like, we got to start looking at other things like what's going to happen with the loot. How long is each phase going to be? What's going to happen with the PvP grind, as our friend Yosdenfar is bringing up in Twitch chat, which I really absolutely want to discuss on their behalf as well. I am genuinely interested what could happen with the rank 14 grind given its 12-month cadence. But first and foremost, that leveling cut. North, I'll throw it to you. Now, look, I understand, and I'll bring this up actually maybe when I throw it to Duranasaur, but I am firmly of the belief that this had to happen. It had to happen. You could not do a 12-month cadence with the original leveling rate, because it's I don't know. I don't even know why I have to justify it in a weird way. I just think like whilst we're sitting here saying, yes, we're hardcore players and, some people wanted a more hardcore server, I just feel it's bizarre to basically say to a bunch of casuals, which is the majority of the player base, maybe not so much with Classic, but still, you can't play. This one's not for you. Don't even bother, because by the time your scrub ass is level 60 by 9 months in, the server's almost wrapped up. It's a weird thing for me to wrap my head around. And I got so many emails through the course of Classic of, mum and dad gamers saying like, yay, I just dinged 60, 15 months into Classic or something. It happens. Not everyone does have 10, 15, 20 hours to play the game a week. Now, I appreciate catering to hardcore players, but I also respect the need to balance that around including less hardcore players. So North, my very, very long extrapolated question for you is, are you of the belief that these two had to be handcuffed together, or there was a world in which you could keep the original leveling rates and a 12-month cadence?
You could, right? But in the same way that you could, right? I could walk down the street, find, I won't go in that hypothetical. Anyway, right, like I could do very, very stupid things for no reason, right, in the aspect of life, right? Like, but that doesn't mean I should, right? Could you have done this? Yes. Would it have catered to very specific communities of people who very much did enjoy the leveling process? A good friend of mine, Cargos, he's very distraught, and I'm sure Duranasaur and the other people of the Cargo community, they're very distraught by this change because, and I think it speaks to Duranasaur's earlier point, because they wanted to make content on their own. Right? They wanted the content to be their content, right? The things that they needed, right? Like they use the game as a canvas, right? And they create their own content. And for something like the Ragnaros race that they're doing, hardcore no deaths, go in and try and kill Rag. I think that's a very, very interesting thing. It's a little bit sabotaged by this because the 12-month tenure doesn't really mean anything to them, right? So they're kind of off the timetable because all they're really seeking is Ragnaros. So for them, it does hurt them. But I think that ultimately trying to force your players to rely on like very specific conceits of how the game should be played is bad, right? If hardcore, right, like hardcore leveling, like it's to me, it's a lot less appealing. I didn't think the changes would be this extreme. I don't think that they're extreme, but I didn't think they would be this extreme. I didn't think they would be this pronounced. I thought they would be less. I thought they would do less. They would reintroduce the Chrono Boon. And I think maybe break mage boosting. I thought that was the only two changes they would possibly make. Maybe alter ranking slightly. and introduce battlegrounds at a different time. Those are the only changes that I thought would come about. So these changes, I think they're good for most people, right? Very specific subsets of the population, not so much. But even hardcore players, I think this is a good change for hardcore players because a lot of hardcore players, they want multiple characters. One of the most dangerous and deleterious things that we saw in Classic WoW was the boosting meta. And if this is less necessary because the leveling experience is, again, less arduous, right? More quest focused and less aggressive, even in a shorter time frame, it'll be easier and more fun to level alts. And I think that caters really ultimately to everyone other than those relying on the longevity of the leveling experience as really a cornerstone in their sort of like vibe check. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Duranasaur, I'll throw it to you, and then Tito's just entered the chat. I'll throw it to you after Duranasaur, mate. Thanks so much for putting your hand up. Small reminder to everyone listening live on Twitch and everyone in the Discord town hall. You can be a part of this chat, guys. This is not just, us three shooting the shit. This is for everyone. This is community talk. Jump in. I'll throw the link in Twitch chat again. Click the button to put your hand up. Get in and speak your view on this one. But Duranasaur, mate, I completely understand as well. I don't want to sound heartless and cold on this one. I know that you guys are brokenhearted from the hardcore community with the RAG challenge that was going to come up with this one. A lot of planning had gone into it. A lot of preparation had gone into it. And now a lot of you feel that has all been perhaps for naught. My honest question though is, and mate, please don't think I'm not trying to be a dick about this one. I'm just playing devil's advocate to a certain extent. And
you're good, Josh.
Thanks, mate. Thanks. And I'm genuinely interested to know sort of a bit of a peek into your psyche on this one, because in a world where the RAG challenge was never conceived, how do you think you'd feel about this news right now?
I think that the sped up leveling was never going to be something that I would advocate for, because I think the 1 to 60 journey in vanilla is an integral part of the game. And I actually think it's really interesting that Blizzard is making this change, that they went from the true 1 to 60 at regular rates to now having it be sped up, because this is the reverse of what we went through on private servers. From, starting 8 or 10 years ago, private servers that were trying to get players to come play their illegal vanilla version of WoW, they were trying to entice players by saying, hey, come play on our server. We'll give you 10 times experience rates, 10 times drop rates, all these things, because they knew that players were interested more in the end game than anything else. And over time, what happened was the community gave more and more feedback saying, we don't want that. We don't want that. We don't want that. So then you got to a point with Nostalrius, and then Chronos and these other servers that were like, actually 1 times XP rates, baseline rates for vanilla are what the player base really wants, whether they necessarily understand why. It's just, it brings more life to the world, right? Which is something North touched on as we were getting started here. The longer it takes you to level, that's the more time you spend out in the world. That's the more lower level resources get brought into the market, into the economy. It makes the world feel more worthwhile when you have a reason to go into these lower level zones and you have players in these lower level zones. And so the sped up leveling for me feels like, a step backwards into this like almost dark age of vanilla WoW from private servers, where it was like, oh, we're going to take emphasis away from these like the leveling process of the game, away from the lower level experience. And we're instead going to put more emphasis on the end game content because we think that's what players really care about. And I think that that's going to bite them in the butt. I really do.
I think that there's a good comparison to make initially in terms of what people were willing to sort of settle for. Like, they did want the more Blizz-like experience at the end of the day, right? They did want higher or lower quests, lower rates of experience, but I think that's in part because of the way that was implemented early on, right? It wasn't, at the bare minimum, I've never seen a 1.5x XP server. I've certainly never seen a 1.3x times XP server. I've never seen a 1.2, right? If the changes that we see are going in, it ups quest XP by about 30%. Those are the changes they've essentially proposed, is 30% on quests only, which is not a terribly large amount. That even conservatively, even if it were a 30% total, I've never seen a server with so small of a bump forward, right? And you had TBC servers as well, when they were a lot more seasonal than vanilla servers, because people were, vanilla servers much more popular, so you could maintain longer phases for more people. right? You had these TPC servers that, lived and died by the 2x 1 to 60, right? Even with increased 2.4.3 rates. Because people don't want to do it over and over and over and over again, with some exceptions, right? If they're in it for the long haul, they're in it for the long haul. But if we're agreeing this is a 6-month server or a 12-month server, right? They're not as much in it for the long haul. It's not as much about the vibe. So, and I think especially when you put that in line with this being about at max a 20% increase potentially with what they propose currently in XP, I don't think that's especially outlandish. I don't think it's really is a step backward. When people showed Blizzard in mass how unwilling they were to actually level, if there's an alternative, even if it costs them enormous amounts of real money, to buy gold and boost characters. Everyone was doing that, right? Sure, you can force people to, you can break boosting and then, try and break gold buying as best you can. You won't really succeed, but you can try as best you can, ban more people, be more vigilant. But ultimately, you'll get a much deader game because a lot of people aren't willing to endure how long the vanilla leveling process is. And we saw that. We have the empirical data. We saw how popular boosting became, especially on larger servers. But on every server, it was a problem, right? So if people are shouting down Blizzard effectively with what is, hey, please, for the love of God, change this thing, I'm not going to blame Blizzard for that. I don't think it's a step back. I think they're addressing a real problem with the current atmosphere of gamer, which is, hey, this is too long. Maybe let's shorten it just a little bit. Maybe let's be reasonable. Let's do a change where it still feels long, but isn't as ridiculous, right? Because people will circumvent it in really shitty ways when it is.
Sorry, you go, Duranasaur.
I was going to say, I think that's a super fair point. And I think that in a vacuum, like if they broke mage boosting and they got rid of, people being able to, essentially pay real money to get gold to then get their characters leveled up. If they got rid of all of that and in exchange, the community was given this, 20% increase in leveling, then I think it'd be an easier pill to swallow. But
you see the benefits in the world, right? Like I was, no one more so than me was heartbroken. Well, maybe OG Jeffrey, but few were more heartbroken than me at seeing how dead the world was at the advent of this boosting. I've decried it for months and months and months and months. I hate it, right? Because of it does these things. Sure, the percentage XP does do that thing as well, right? And in my ideal world, you just break the boosting and you tell people, you say fuck it, and you have like one server. And, it's enough pop for that one server. You've got the hardcore people and you've got, the casuals who enjoy, the vanilla vibes. But I think this is more popular. I think this is more feasible for them as a company because it ends up being more popular, right? I think we do have to be, and I hate this. I'm like cautioning being rational about this when like that's like not my forte at all. But like, they have to make a profit. That's it's a pitfall of capitalism, right? They're a public company. They have to make profit. This is more profitable, but it's still a decent game, right? Like it still preserves a lot of what we love, more of what we love, in exchange for, I think, a fairly small, concession. So I think ultimately, I think that's the best we're gonna get, unfortunately.
I think because I kind of am coming at a lot of these issues from like 2 points of view. So for this one, the one side of me that is the end game player, the raider and stuff, like I agree with you 100%. And I hope that they do break mage boosting and that what ends up happening is you just see a full world of people that are willing to level with this like slightly sped up experience. But then I also have this, the hardcore player in me, the true leveler, the person, like I think the 1 to 60 journey is one of the greatest things in gaming. And the hardcore community really showcases that. So that part of it, like that one is definitely hard to swallow. Because while, you can absolutely still do the hardcore challenge with this like experience boost, it's going to have like a little asterisk next to it that like, oh, you did 1 to 60 in hardcore, but you did it when they started the seasonal thing. So you didn't do like true vanilla. You did, the one with the little extra boost to it.
Just on that, Duranasaur, sorry, one question, North, and Tito, I'm going to throw it to you real quick, just after this question to Duranasaur, and then whenever North sort of finishes up on this point. But Duranasaur, just as an aside, couldn't you also conceivably still do the RAG challenge on a classic era server with everyone?
I think that's I'm not a part of the conversation that's like deciding any of this stuff, but I've even thrown that out there that, okay, well, we still have this as an option.
Yeah.
So it is, I think that it's still a tough pill to swallow because ideally we would be able to join in, the fresh experience
and continue on with those
community.
characters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that part. Sorry, North, one quick thing and then I'll throw it to Tito.
Oh, no, he can go ahead.
Okay, too easy. Tito, sorry, you've been patiently waiting, mate. Then Catastrophic, I'll get to you straight after Tito. Thanks so much for putting your hands up, guys. It's great to get new voices in here. Tito, mate, you and I have talked many times in the past. Obviously, we play the game together as well. Look, I think this leveling rate discussion is going to be the spiciest meatball amongst all of these classic fresh changes. It's definitely the one that's driving the most conversation already online from what I've seen. People are either really happy or fucking up in arms about it. And I sort of really am enjoying seeing both sides of the arguments on this one. Where do you fall on it? And do you think it's a good or a bad thing?
I'm definitely pretty torn about it. I think there's a couple of meta reasons why I think it's fast, because being so close to classic, it kind of creates a sense of urgency where in this day and age where attention spans are so short, people will play just so they don't miss out, which will boost populations in that way. And then, not being so long, people have already done these phases, so they probably will get burnt out quicker and leave. So just having them short does kind of create that sense of, missing out. So therefore they will stay. So from a meta reason.
Sorry, mate, you're just gone a bit robot. You're gone a bit robot.
My personal gameplay preferences, I'd much prefer it to be a little bit longer. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you now. Just say that last part again.
Yeah, beauty. I think from my personal gameplay preferences, I would rather it be longer. But yeah, I think for meta reasons, it probably is good for the population that it's shorter.
All right. Sorry, keep going, mate.
As far as speed goes of leveling and, reducing mage boosting, I'm not sure if people have missed this, but just before TBC, mob tagging in the world was the fastest way to get to 60. And that needs to be addressed as well. Otherwise, there's going to be major problems there.
Well, you think that could be the new, if they do tinker with mage boosting, the mob tagging thing will just be the new thing?
I think it already will be the new thing because it was so quick. It was less than 24 hours, I believe. And it hasn't even been, the meta hasn't been discovered, and there's probably quicker ways. And if that does kick in, which it will, I do definitely think it will kick in if they don't fix that as well, then there's quest mobs are going to be so contested, world mobs are going to be so contested, the world will be alive in a bad way. Okay. So that needs to be looked at as well, I think.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying for sure. Hey, Catastrophic, mates, if you're good to talk now, I'll throw it to you and ask you again on these leveling rates. People are going to be very passionate one way or another. Where do you fall?
Hey, thanks for having me first.
My pleasure.
I just started kind of actually, really getting into the hardcore community the past 2 weeks, and I've kind of fallen head over heels for it. And I've been playing the game, since it came out way back when, and I just never really got into it until recently. And so I've kind of been able to dip my feet into both waters of, the XP leveling rate. And, I was looking forward to the kind of the Road to Rags stuff too, with Duranasaur in the hardcore community. I think it might kind of negatively impact it. I don't really know if it'll impact it as a lot of people maybe think it will in a heavily visible way yet. Just because, I know we still have a beta to look forward to. And overall, though, I'm kind of with Duranasaur and, other people talking about this, where it's the fresh feeling is kind of hard to quantify. And I think that's what a lot of people were really hoping for, and maybe we'll still get that. But at the same time, I still think it's kind of it could have been worse, I think, in ways. They really could have went full bore on higher XP rates, but then again, that would just be a private server thing. So I feel we're kind of we're getting things that I can like and not like. But I guess I'm kind of torn, but I think overall I'm content with it.
Yeah. Look, I'll finish up on this point, then I'll move us on to the next talking point. But just with regards to my thoughts on the leveling rates, look, I don't want people to think that I'm not as in love passionately with the 1 to 60 experience in Classic WoW as well. I think it is absolutely, as Duranasaur says, one of the most majestic experiences in gaming. It's fucking fantastic. You know, a lot of modern gamers might disagree with it, but that's how I feel. I'm old school in that regard. But, in saying that, whilst I believe it's a treasure and should always be made available to us, I am completely compartmentalizing my thoughts on this Fresh Classic server, where this is the alternate reality. This is the what if. This is, you know, Marvel's what if series. What if vanilla was done a little bit differently on an official server? Well, here we're getting it, as I said, like a thought experiment. And because it's such a shorter period of time, like this 12-month server, that's why I'm like, okay, fuck it. You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. I'm not necessarily a subscriber to the thought that every iteration of a classic server at any given point in time must be done the same way. We did the no changes thing. We had fun. But now I am okay with mixing it up a bit. Now, some people might say, but Josh, that if this is popular, that paves the way for Blizzard to do the seasonal thing and never return to the old classic rates. Not necessarily. There are fucking options out there for them to do whatever in the future. And as I say, there is always classic era servers there, albeit with the very big disadvantage of not being many people there to play with. I get that, but it's a hairy one. I'm okay with it. It's short term. Let's see what happens. North. Yeah, let's throw it to you, mate, because I want to bring up the next point. Look, actually, I should say this ties in, because we've got Battlegrounds from the get-go here. And as Yuzdanfar was very good to bring up in Twitch chat, something I didn't even consider, which I probably would have taken me a little while to fucking figure out because I'm not a PvP player, but I'm going to be for Classic Fresh, hopefully. How the fuck would a 12-month cadence work with the PvP grind? And I'm genuinely interested as well if you've got any ideas off the top of your head of, is it just as simple as truncating, I don't know, the what it takes to get to rank 14, or is rank 10 the new rank 14 or some weird fucking shit like that? What would you do?
So fundamentally, right, the ranking system's a little weird to alter. I think at the end of the day, I think it's very challenging because in part, right, if you're like, oh, well, you know, you take off 3 ranks, maybe rank 11 is now rank 14 and you sort of adjust down. That never works, right? In part because, well, it could work, right? But it doesn't preserve a lot of what's going on because most of the rank and most of the dangerous part of the rank is always the last 3 ranks, right? Because the decay is so high, the breakpoints for decay only get high when you talk about really rank 12, rank 13, and rank 14. So prior to that, the decay is pretty minimal, right? So if you would adjust it in that way, maybe that does end up working because a lot of people are sort of disillusioned with how the rank grind is going because of the later decay. I would be for a reduction in decay. And so you could just make it that. You could make rank 12 the top rank. You could just remove 2 ranks. That removes essentially, I believe it's 5 weeks of bracket 1 spots, which is the highest possible ranking point game that you can get in vanilla. I believe it's 5. It has to be 5 because it's always 3 from 13 to 14. And so it's at a minimum of 5. It can be more depending on what breakpoints you have, but assuming you've got bracket 1 all the way up, it ends up being 5 weeks. You're taking off 5 weeks of the grind. That is a lot of time, right? And it makes it so much easier to do it casually. So I think that would be a good change. That being said, we've had shorter servers where that rank grind was not touched at all. Not even slightly. And it worked fine. Right? So I think that I think that they don't need per se to touch it. Especially because if you make it that much easier, it kind of enforces this weird meta. Shorter server, honor gear available from the beginning. You have rank gear being enormously powerful from the rip. And several months of there's literally no gear that even kind of remotely compares to it. So it's a bit dicey. Private servers handled it by having the early rank gear in. So they had the early versions of it when it wasn't so ridiculous, but they also had the early versions of tier, etc. So overall power level was lower for most classes that weren't rogues or warriors, because rogue and warrior tier actually still was good back then, because they rely on base stats, and that's how the stats really were allocated on early gear. So they could alter it. They could also not. It doesn't, fundamentally, I don't think it really matters because I think that grind affects such a small percentage of people in reality.
Okay. Durana, any strong feelings on the ranking system in a shortened server?
Not particularly. I'm also not a huge PvPer. I think that North does bring up good points though about the power level of that gear, and no matter what they decide to do about the timeline or the decay or whatever it is, that I think was kind of an issue during Classic, that people were able to get such powerful gear so early. So hopefully that's just something that they keep in mind.
And this is even, right, like this is exponentially worse because, right, the earliest you could get the rank gear was the week before BWL, right? BWL for a lot of classes will provide gear that is comparable. Not better in a lot of cases, but comparable. And so with it being available in phase 1 from the rip, if they reduce it to, say, rank 12, they take 5 weeks off of it, I believe that makes it a 7-week rank, which means before even world bosses are out, you'll have people decked out in rank 14 gear, which means that the world boss loot to them is almost entirely irrelevant already. Which I don't think is a problem in and of itself because, so few people actually get that achievement. So few people actually get to that area and that sort of achievement. I think that adjusting the population things for ranking as well might be clever. I think that it's I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I'm guessing you are, all of you probably. The people creating level 1 characters to then kill to add to the population pools, exploits of that variety are a problem in the old ranking system. And I think that it's because in part, like, the old ranking system is a bit unfair. It does throw curveballs to you where you don't have a consistent number of people per server. I think that maybe they should just make it, more a la Arena, where it's like, it's just, hey, there's a certain number of people that can fit. Well, actually, not Arena at all, actually, because that's based on population as well. I think they should just, cap it off a certain number of players, right? Maybe 6 players bracket 1, maybe 5 players bracket 1, maybe 10 players bracket 1, but they should cap it off so it's consistent in a way where it's less, you have to game less around what the population pool is on, these fancy add-ons that scan people, because people are going to min-max it that way, and they want to stack honor, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. So I think that having it be a little more consistent, having potentially the contribution of, change per population size or making it fixed would solve some of the pains in ranking that make it a little bit, it's small quality of life stuff like that, which make it a little more breathable, but not actually change really how fast you get it in any way.
Guys, we'll move on to another part of the timing, which is rating within a 12-month window. And I know both of you will be interested in this one because I'm intrigued to see what your answers will be. It's so unique when we think of lockouts and how many lockouts you'll get in to squeeze out some gear before moving on to the next phase and whatnot. Now, I think there's absolutely a great framework for this to work within WoW Classic Fresh. And, one of my chief complaints about Classic was it fucking sucks that everyone has the same gear, 90 fucking odd % of whatever the population is clearing all the content. Every warrior is a cookie cutter warrior. They're all wearing their fucking AQ shoulders and whatever. Everyone looks the same. It's all a bit bizarre. We're all just aesthetically and statistically homogenous. But I feel like this cadence might shake things up a little bit because they've said we're going to give you obviously 12 months, but unlock a phase roughly every couple of months. Now you do the maths, 52 weeks on the 12-month server divided by 6 phases, about 9 weeks per phase. Now, that doesn't really create a seismic shift, I think, in the early goings. Things like Molten Core, you get 9 weeks with it before moving on to phase 2, but no new raids come in phase 2. So then it's another 9 weeks before BWL comes out. Well, now you've had 18, Molten Core lockouts before BWL opens up. So that's plenty of time. Then in phase 4, Zol Garub comes and, you catch up gear. And again, you get 18 lockouts with BWL before AQ comes out. The really interesting part to me will be, and I fucked this up when I was talking about this in Discord earlier. I didn't really know what the fuck I was talking about, but I've wrapped my head around it more now. But the interesting part will be for me when AQ comes and you get 9 weeks with AQ before having to move on to Nax with maybe only getting a handful of pieces from AQ with your 40-man raid. I think that'll be really spicy and really interesting. But North, again, I'll start with you, mate, and just ask, I guess it's hard to talk about this without also taking into consideration the ramped up difficulty that they've said that they will be delivering to us. But, there's conceivably a world out there where now the first few weeks for, maybe not the best guilds in the world, but the first few weeks for the average guild in WoW Classic Fresh might actually be progression. And now you get fewer lockouts. Just in general, what do you think of it all?
It's brilliant, right? The experience, right? The social experience of progression, I think, is actually legitimately and fundamentally brilliant, even when the content's relatively simple, even when it's breakpoints that aren't great, because it forces you to interact with players longer. It forces you to interact with players, and it does stress you in some ways. Maybe people don't like that kind of stress, but I think that kind of stress is good because it encourages players to play well. It encourages players to, farm more consumes, to be out in the world more. It encourages them to raid for longer times and raid more often. People are complaining about, I have my one lockout of the day. People would clear Nax, AQ, BWL, and Molten Core all in one day, right? For a lot of people, right, like for the more hardcore guilds anyway, other guilds would not, but I think encouraging more gameplay and less access to gear cuts down on
homogenization. I'll help you out.
I was trying to say homogeneity.
Yeah, I was about to have to hit the fucking bleep button on you.
Eight different pronunciations of that one word. Anyway, the root is terrible. Anyway, but it creates a situation in which you do have stratas of people again, which I think is very interesting. When you add mechanics back, like for instance, a lot of people don't know about this. If you weren't a private server player, Gar had a mechanic early on where he would explode his ads, right? Or enrage them upon his death, right? This will certainly wipe guilds that aren't prepared. It might even wipe guilds that are prepared, right? He could explode them on private servers. I'm not sure if this is how it worked even later, or if this is how it worked early on. Maybe it was private server, but he could explode banished Gar ads, right? So the strat fundamentally changes on him, right? Having warlocks in the raid fundamentally changes the progression identity of the guild fundamentally changes. And then you have to adapt. You have to play more. You have to play smarter. You have to play harder. You have to show up with more consumes. So you have to be in the world more often. And it creates this feedback loop, I think, with more difficult content and more progression. How many consumes are you using, Josh, if you one-shot Ragnaros? Well, obviously you're using one fire protection potion, maybe two. If you've wiped to Ragnaros 15 times, you hit a wall on consumes, which forces your guild into the world, which I think is some of the best times I had on private servers were going and farming with these fire elemental invasions that people don't even know about. People don't appreciate the fire elemental invasions added in the second phase of Classic, where an Ungoro, I'm not even sure you know about it, where the Ungoro volcano starts spawning fire elementals in mass. And it's brilliant for farming elemental fire for greater fire protection potions. And you have to defend the boss at the top. If you don't defend the boss at the top, it ends. And so you have this very unique and interesting goal and resource and really in this battlefield out in the world. It pushes people into the area where WoW and specifically vanilla WoW succeed the most. And so I think for that reason it's brilliant. Make it harder. Give us less lockouts because this will force us time and time again to go where it actually matters. Right? And some people will say, oh, well, it'll force people to buy gold, this, that, and the other. It'll do other things. It will do other negative things as well. But every aspect will have some negativity to it. And most people, I think, will then be forced to go out in the world. They'll feel better just going out and mining if they're increasing these herb spawns to get more arcane crystals, to get more arcane bombs, right? To get more lotus for more flasks, for more progression, right? You have this increased ability to get resources out in the world because Blizzard is recognizing that is the strength of the game. And I think that is the first time in years, in a decade, where they have recognized what makes their game good. What makes this version of the game better than the other versions in any aspect. It's the first time where I've seen them on the money, and it fills me with joy.
Wow, there you go. Fuck, I feel like I'm listening to Patton's speech or something. You're getting fired up. I love it. Mates, I'll throw it over to you, Catastrophic. You've put your hand up again, mate. I'd love to hear from you. You might have just heard something that made you feel like you want to speak up. So, mate, what do you have to say from what North just said about the rating in a constricted sort of timing?
Yeah, so going off what he said kind of made me triggered, made me think about a positive thought about, with this compounded cadence structure we're going to get from PvE, him talking about how it's making people in guilds that have to progress, really go farm their consumes and stuff. I think it'll kind of put an interesting spin too if we're going to get a fresh PvP server where, depending on how many there would even be, say there's even only one PvP server they make for this, with these shorter cadence times between phases, like North was saying, people are going to have to go farm these consumes, and now you're going to have people on Alliance and Horde and hopefully an ideally, balanced server fighting over a lot of these consumes, getting some like maybe true endgame world PvP out there for some of these consumes that might be camped and stuff. And so I think that'll be kind of at least as far as viewing content goes, for people that stream on Twitch, I think that'll be pretty entertaining to watch too. So yeah, I definitely think for people that are trying to progress in guilds, it's going to be, I don't want to say necessarily harder, but it'll be more entertaining, especially if they're on a PvP server.
And I think that right, like the increased herb spawns and the ore spawns and stuff, it means that they're rewarding you for going out in the world, right? They recognize that that's where you want to be, and so we won't have to sit in Dire Maul tribute runs potentially. We won't have to sit in Dire Maul East farming things. We have to sit in Maraudin farming, right? Like all the time, instanced away, locked away. Because even if you're losing out there in the world, there's enough, hopefully, that they make it so that even if you're losing, there's something to be gained out there. And I think that's such an important part of the game, really, to share with other people, is that you can be out in the world. There can be this content where people are actually fighting over resources and just for one, and I don't know if we'll talk about this, but one of the incentives that I think, especially when the ranking system is done early, and this will trigger some people, and I would encourage a lot of people to think hard and think long about whether or not they want to be in a PvP server, especially during the first week of Classic. I will, and a lot of other people, will be getting to level 30 as quick as possible. Then I will be leveling engineering as quick as possible, and then I will be slaughtering everyone in Stranglethorn for hours and hours until the week is over.
Well,
there will be no exceptions. There will be no survivors. There will be no quarter given in the entirety. So Stranglethorn Vale, people talk about it being Vietnam. No one knows what Stranglethorn Vale is like compared to a private server where ranking is out on week 1, because that is the best place for honor. I'm not going to level to 60 first week. I'm not going to go for a Mage Blade first week. I'm going to go and kill as many little trolls and orcs and fucking, other mud hut races as I can, and thousands, if not tens of thousands, will be slaughtered in the fields, in the jungle.
Mate, I picture you playing in like your fucking Buffalo Bill compounds, like with Goodbye Horses playing in the background and everything while you're going through STV.
I'm currently in talks about renting a house for 4, 5, 6 people to come, and we're gonna sit there, green and black face paint on in the bushes, ghillie suits on, murdering everyone. So, and people, right? People get upset, right? Like, avoid STV then, right? If you don't want to do it, avoid the PvP server. Don't roll for the first week. After the first week, you need Battlegrounds, right? There'll be enough 60s that Battlegrounds will be the way to go. But for the first week, it is chaos. And that, I think this is such a good incentive as well, right? People might not think that. People might think that, this punishes people too much. It's phase 2 all over again. If it's only for a week, it ends up being fun, right? If it's only for a week, that chaos, you thrive in it. The ephemerality of it, right? The transient nature of these things make them so much more enjoyable because you blink and they're gone. And it was an experience that, right? Like that you don't even want to replicate because you respect it on its own, right? You respect that those were good times on their own, and you don't want to try and, nostalgically, piece them back together because they were special in their own way.
You need to send me the link to that feed while you guys do that in the house. Duranasaur, let me throw it over to you, mate, and just ask in general on the rating. How do you feel about everything that you just heard in regards to that stuff?
I think that it's really easy to look at it in a vacuum and look at it from the perspective of maybe, those of us who were able to level fast, and get in there and see like, oh man, like harder content, sign me up. Like this faster raid release, sign me up. Like I want to do the content. I want to do it quicker. I want to like be in multiple raids and have all this stuff going on. And I think that like there's a big thing that people aren't really talking about, which is who is this actually for? Right? Because when we're talking about having the raids be like this, is it for more casual players? Because I don't think that it is at this point, right? I think that even with the expedited leveling, with the getting more XP from quests and everything, it's not going to be for them because the raids are going to be harder, which means they're going to need more consumables, which means they're going to need more time to actually raid. They're going to actually have to do progression. They're going to actually have way more of a time commitment than they ever did in original Classic. So these players that were probably the ones that said we don't want world buffs, we want the game to have less of a time commitment to it so that it can be done in my own abbreviated schedule. These people are going to actually have more things that they need to do. So in my opinion, it's not for the casual players. So then is it for the hardcore players, right? And again, I don't think so, because every hardcore player that I have talked to, I've been hanging out in these different discords with, guilds, salad bakers and onslaught players and these different hardcore players that they did Classic as hard as they could. And you ask them, are you interested in coming and doing this? And across the board, they're like, no, they took away world buffs. They took away our ability to speed run. They're making the game for casuals. And so you're losing the hardcore players because you're taking away the option for them to be able to push the game to its brink. And that's my whole big thing, my whole issue with them removing world buffs is that they didn't have to do that for people to not use world buffs. World buffs were always optional. No one was ever forced to use them. You may have felt forced, but at the end of the day, they were always optional. You could find a guild, you could find a group of players who were not interested in using them.
That's such a cop out though, because right, when the game is fundamentally different that way, right? Like when people are given the option, right, to set up beforehand, and set up in a way where, right, sure, they have to spend maybe an hour or two doing world buffs, maybe if they're alliance, maybe much longer. Of course they're going to do that, right? Because most players are going to require it of people. If you come to a GDKP without those buffs, right, you're going to get lower priority on certain things.
Right, but if you don't want to use them, you find players who don't want to use them, right?
There are few though, right? That's very few players do that.
But that isn't the case, right? If it was such a large outcry from the Classic community that, hey, Blizzard, we don't want world buffs, then clearly there's enough of a player base that they could have left them in and those players could have gotten together and raided together and played together, right? It doesn't make any sense to say, hey, the majority of people didn't want world buffs, but at the same time, there aren't enough of them playing to just get together and play together.
That does make sense if you were taking for granted two things. One, when you're doing that, you are putting yourself relatively at a disadvantage to every other player, essentially for vibes, right? And so, right, when the norm becomes in Classic, right, when everyone has this gear. If you don't have it, if you're not going into every lockout and clearing every lockout, and if that's a risk, if you don't have world buffs, you are sabotaging yourself, whereas this puts everyone on an equal playing field. The second, and I think the more important thing to discuss that I think you're taking for granted is your suggestion that players will not min-max the fun out of the game. That is a very well-documented thing. Players time and time again will min-max the fun out of a game if it means that it's a min-max, because people are bred that way, they're adjusted that way, they're used to it, right? In order to get them to appreciate that slower cadence in raid, in the same way that I'm sure a lot of people appreciate a slower cadence in leveling, right? You have to force them. If you gave two players the option of leveling at 1 time speed or 2 times speed, and it was a competitive game, almost everyone is going to choose the 2 times speed, even if they want the 1 time speed, because their friends are like, hey man, why aren't you leveling with us? Why aren't you coming with us? So what's the deal? Oh, you can't get world buffs, man, then you can't raid. You gotta get in here. You gotta be farming it every week, right? And even if it's taking more time, right? It might be, oh, well, the casual player has to play it for longer. They have to farm more consumes. They have to do these things. But that's what the casual player, in my opinion, would prefer doing rather than, and especially from my perspective, this is what I would think as a casual player. And obviously I'm not, but trying to think as one, I wouldn't want to have to spend time before my raid going and searching out these buffs and waiting for these drops and logging in, logging out, scouting other accounts. That's really, really obnoxious. I would prefer to log in, even if raid took twice as long, right? If it took 4 hours instead of 2, right? If it took 2 hours instead of 1, I would prefer to just log in, maybe drop an Onyxia head and go to raid. I don't I don't want to deal with all that other bullshit because it's on different times. They have a certain amount of time, a certain day set aside. I don't think it's a time limit for them. I think it's just more annoying to have to log in to get the buffs themselves.
I agree with North on that one. Joanna, I'll throw it to you in one sec. I agree with North on that one in terms of, and if anything, I am the filthiest casual here, so I do feel somewhat qualified to step in and speak up. But, yeah, I agree with North that I think there's definitely different goals for the casual player. That goes without saying. But I think the casual player cares far less about getting to raids and clearing raid content as much as people think. The casual player is happy being a babe in the woods. They're happy just running around the world doing something, anything that occupies them, that makes them feel like, Ralph Wiggum, I'm helping. It really is a case where I think giving the casual player accessibility is all that they really need. They, whether or not they're clearing the content, they, some of them might care, but I think it's just, I'm trying, it's how they have their fun. But Duranasaur, back to one of your earlier points, and I'd really, feel the need to speak up on this one because I'll partially answer my own question because I'm a fuckwit, but then I'll throw it to you, Duranasaur, and then Fark you, I'll definitely bring you into the mix on this one. It's funny for me to hear you say, even though I'm not shocked because I know this opinion is out there, I've seen it en masse, when the hardcore players absolutely vigorously want world buffs in the game because that's the way in which they like to push content. I understand that. But it also strikes me as exceedingly ironic that hardcore players shirk away from a challenge. They're the most hardcore players, and they're the ones thumbing their noses at a more difficult or bigger challenge. Now, the partial answer that I'll throw in for you, Joanna, that you might say, Josh, you're absolutely right, I don't know, maybe not, is that hardcore players don't deem it as a challenge. It's not challenging. It's a fucking time sink. We've talked about this before. Higher HP pools for bosses does not equal greater difficulty. It is just asking more fucking time from the raiders. I get that take. But now I'll throw it to you, Duranasaur, and just ask that question. Is it that hardcore players aren't shirking a challenge, but they just view it as just wasted time?
I think that it's absolutely a view of wasted time because I don't think in the vanilla method of raiding, right, where you don't have a normal heroic and a mythic versions of the raid to choose from, you have one type of raid and everyone does that. You cannot tune it to the point where it is actually difficult for a high-end hardcore guild to go in and clear the content and then also have that same content be out there and expect the casual player to enjoy it, right? You're not going to get both of those things with one raid type. It's just not going to happen. And so when you end up in the middle, which I think they're trying to do, I think they are trying to make the content more difficult. All you're doing is, showing the hardcore players like, hey, we're trying to make this a little bit harder, but at the same time, our way of making it harder is by limiting the resources that you are able to collect and use in game, which is what world buffs are. They're just resources you're able to collect and use in game in order to push the boundaries of your play. And so when you tell hardcore players, like, we're going to make things more difficult by limiting those things, all you're telling them is that, hey, we're going to break down this game the way that you want to play it and instead cater more to the more casual players. So why would they want to come and get involved in it?
I think that's perhaps one of the best points though, right? Like, I think that the biggest argument against removing world buffs is certainly that players hate, and this is again a very universally well documented thing, I think. Players hate when what they perceive as player power is reduced for no reason. Right, like you see it in especially retail expansions, right? When the artifacts from Legion, were essentially removed, right? A lot of those were included then fundamentally into new specs because players were so upset about losing some of those dynamics in their classes. And I think that's very much true for Warrior, right? Like, I think Warrior is really the class that does miss out on this because their class fundamentally changes entirely with world buffs because they get more rage and they can do more things. No other class changes in that way, right? Like, you either, the number go big, number go small, mages might need more mages to keep up Ignite, but realistically, right, like, no class fundamentally changes in the same way as Warrior. And when you're talking about guilds like Salad Bakers, when you're talking about guilds like Onslaught, they are degenerate Warrior players. All of them. Literally all of them. with very few exceptions, to the point where they're running one mage, one warlock arrayed, and they're running, like 35 warriors, right? Or as many they possibly can. I think that's very, very degenerative. And even if they want to play it that way, that's great, but there's still stuff to min-max. Sure, right? Their player power is decreasing, but I think that that's just a short-sighted thing, right? Obviously their player power is decreasing. Obviously, number not go burr as much. Obviously, they can't recapture as much damage as they're doing in Classic. But why would they want to try and reproduce that again and again and again and again? Right? We get something new here. We get something interesting. We get, right? Hey, what actually is the min-max in damage when you don't have world buffs? Is it a bunch of mages? Is it a mix of warriors? Is it hunters doing a ton of damage with having Hunter's Mark actually being able to up on the boss now? Do Shadow Priests become more viable because they can actually not push off buffs? Like, what about Affliction Warlocks early on? With the 10% hit talent, maybe Siphon Life and Drain is the way to go because you're not consuming buff slots. There's a lot of things that we don't know about and a lot of options for these players to potentially push the envelope, but just not in the way that they're used to doing. So I think it's such a cop-out. I really think that it is a cop-out. It's something that they're used to it. They're comfortable with the meta, and so they don't want it to change. Right? But I think that's right. Like, I think that's such bullshit. Like just embrace, if you don't want to enjoy it, that's fine. If you don't want to, embrace the change, if you liked the warrior thing and you no longer want to play because the warrior thing is dead, that's fine. Right? I can respect that. If you enjoy a very specific aspect and outlet of the game and you don't want to play without it, sure. Right? But just blanket sort of, decrying the changes because player power goes down, I don't think is a good option, because it does end up making things harder and then changing fundamentally how the game plays, and it works better with the systems at play rather than, me clear a raid, every raid in 20 minutes. Now me log out for a whole week. Ooga ooga, right? Like,
I want to bring it back to that meta point. And sorry, go Durana. Finish this up on this one.
I mean, I think that it's easy to just say, like, the way that they were doing it is, it's ooga booga, it's not necessarily the best way to do it, but that's like, that's your opinion, that's their opinion, right? Like, we're splitting hairs over, like, what's the opinion of hardcore speedrunning WoW players versus someone who isn't a hardcore speedrunning WoW player. And I know that I'm probably coming across as the bad guy here by advocating for the hardcore speedrunning WoW players, but that is just an opinion that I have. And I think that as, a minority of a group as that might be, I think that it's important to note that whenever there have been major speedrunning competitions or, DMF weeks and things like that, it is something that is viewed by a significant portion of the community. And it's something that people like to watch. They like to get invested in, whether they play at that level or not. So to just dismiss those players and say, well, they could just try this new thing out instead of doing the thing that they've probably been doing for years now, prior to even Classic coming out. Like, I think that is an unfortunate thing, because you are just straight up saying, hey, all of you players that love this game and have been playing this version of this game for years now, it's going to change fundamentally so in a way that you are no longer able to do the thing that you love in it.
Don't apologize. Wait. No. Bring up one second. I want to bring FarQ into the mix, and then by all means pipe up after FarQ's done. But one thing I'll just say before I throw it to you, FarQ, Duranasaur, mate, do not apologize. Do not feel bad, mate. I'm so happy you're here providing that point of view. By all means, I'm glad you're here speaking up for that element of the community. And I'm really enjoying the back and forth that you and North are having right now, and I'm really feeling bad interjecting, but I do want to inject FarQ as well. But yeah, Duranasaur, please go nuts, mate. Don't feel bad. It's your opinion. Like I said, you're totally entitled to have it. FarQ, mate, you've just walked into a great, very, very passionate, very, very spicy conversation about some of the delivery of the rating and whatnot, and the timing and everything with WoW Classic Fresh servers. Look, mate, just from what you've heard over the last 5 to 8 minutes since you've been here, any thoughts from what you just heard?
Yeah. First off, apologies. So if I skipped anything, or I repeat anything that's been said earlier, I apologize. I wasn't able to get on the stream until now. And with North's side gig as an auctioneer and the cadence that he speaks at, obviously there's been a lot that's been discussed. So I apologize for missing some of that. But what I think, to combine this, where Duranasaur had a really, really nice point, was he said that, who is this for? And at first, I was stuck in my old meta in my world of, well, this is for the people that want a classic experience. And I I looked for holes and I found the holes around that. Then when I got back to what Josh and I had said about the goal needs to be shake up the meta, the compression of this makes it for everybody. And here's the argument I want to make for that. I thought it was going to be for the hardcores to install the compression because the gear compression is going to fundamentally make it so you're going to need 2 alts. You can't take weeks off. It's going to be brutal. And then I thought, what if the goal is not to clear Nax? And that was the problem, is the goal in Classic for almost everybody was, I want to finally get to clear Nax and experience that thing I hadn't experienced before and conquer it. Now the goal is, well, what if I just want to raid for a few months and play with my friends? And if we don't get past AQ, that's okay, because that's what it actually was like for so many of the casuals back then. This takes the hardcore center of the donut that Blizzard has always catered to and said, we want to make sure that you have that experience. And that group is butting its head against the wall in TBC, saying, we're clearing this in 45 minutes. This is not what we expected, and did so in Classic to an extent. And there was the world buff meta and the toxicity. They gave us the Classic experience with all of the modern knowledge. Now they're trying to take the modern knowledge and compress it. And so that compression I love, if you look at it as the fundamental goal of success is to play the game the way you want it. Now, for the onslaughts of the world, the reason that they are degenerate warrior Ugas North is because that was mathematically the fastest way to clear the game in optimized times.
Oh, sure.
Now, as you said, it's going to make it a bit different because they are taking a hit. But those guys, the use of the world North, and I say this in a complimentary way completely, is you are so capable at these types of games that you are going to adapt, and so will these other guys and the speedrunning community guys. So Duranasaur, I think that you're right in that some of these people are going to feel that loss, and casuals who wanted to start again and maybe get through a slightly tougher AQ are going to feel that loss because the compression's not going to let them do that. But it is going to be a fundamentally different experience to which the hardcore players will adapt. So if the casuals can say, I'm going to play as long as I want, if I get through 6 months and we're still wiping on Firemaw and it's just a pain in the butt and I don't like it, oh well. But Blizzard knows, I think they know fundamentally the people who are going to sustain this with their cash are the harder players. And so they are making partly a market decision to appease the hardcore players and make it something where it has an end. And that was one of the tough parts that led to burnout, is people were like, I don't know when this is going to end. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm a year and a half into it and I feel burnt. So it gives you that speed up right away choice, or go through it at your pace choice, but realize you will probably not reach the end of the game. So it sets that horizon further. And that was the part when I finally came to that conclusion this afternoon. I was like, oh, they really got it. This is really cool. And it did what Josh and I had hoped, which is take the meta, shake it up. And if they have already talked about trying to quit mage boosting, if it's pathing, if it's the AoE effect, whatever it is, at the end of the day, it's going to make for a different, more immersive experience. And it's almost the point where I would reconsider subscribing. I can't because of family obligations, but it's to that point. So I think you both made really excellent points, and that's my loop of trying to tie it up.
And that's why we love Fuck You. Just bringing people together. Sorry, North, go for it, man.
No, he's brilliant. I don't think I've ever been to call on with this man again. He reminds me of himself with how excellent his rhetoric is. Wow, what a clever man. But I think that he's right on the money, right? Because I think that that's what the classic experience, right? They're not trying to re-implement things now. They're trying to recreate the old experience. And I think the old experience was better because it had people out in the world. And so then they're realizing,
yes.
Okay, like what with these modern limitations, right? Well, people could clear it so fast, and people could, right, ignore the Sons of Ragnaros, right? People could ignore the transitions on Four Horsemen by destroying the first boss first. You fundamentally change, especially in PvE, these encounters with the amount of damage you're able to do in such a quick time. And that's why I call it degenerate, right? Because it does circumvent a lot of mechanics. It is very fun. It is very cool. Like it is bleeding edge, and it does makes for some very, very cool clips and for some very, very cool viewing experiences. And you'll not find, a qualm in me. I think it's regrettable that aspect of the game would be removed, right? I think it would be replaced with something else, but it wouldn't be fully replaced, right? So I do think that that's regrettable, Duranasaur, and maybe I'm not expressing that as well as I should have been previously. I think that's regrettable, as much as it is degenerate for the rest of the game, because it reduces consumable expenses, it reduces raid time, it increases the availability of gear to the point where you now have a strata between players. I think that it ultimately is still fun in and of itself, but I think it ends up being bad for the game. And what ends up being better, I think, is this return to form where not everyone has to clear all the content. You were saying, well, if there's only one difficulty, you can't make it so hard that the casuals can't do it, but then the hardcore players are challenged by it. I think you can, because what worked in vanilla, and maybe this is nostalgia, and maybe this doesn't cater to the modern player, and maybe I'm just very, very much out of touch. But the most fun that I ever had raiding in World of Warcraft was and obviously this is, anecdotal Andy, but the most fun I ever had was in Burning Crusade during Tier 5 while Tier 6 was out. My guild could not kill Vash and KT. We progressed on Vash for maybe, I don't even know, it was week after week after week after week, and we could not kill Vash. We could only enter Black Temple when the attunements were eventually removed. I believe when Sunwell was released, it might have been when Zilliman was released. I forget which, but I think it was Sunwell, right? And so eventually we got into Black Temple. But those weeks when we were progressing on Vash, each week when we were like having some troubles, like getting through tier, like a lot of Tempest Keep and most of Serpent Shrine Cavern, that's when I had the most fun, because I was spending time out of raid leveling my professions so that I could get better buff food, right? So that I could get better professions, so that I could get better gear outside in the heroic, so I get some more badge gear to help out, right? Because it wasn't just min-max, because that wasn't the only avenue offered in the game, because the content is so easy. I think when it's harder, it forces you really to adapt in ways that we haven't been forced to adapt quite yet. So I welcome the challenge. I understand that it is regrettable that, we were losing an aspect of the things that, like, players from Salad Bakers, from Onslaught, from Progress, things that they loved and that were near and dear to their hearts. And a lot of people will lose that viewing experience. But I think ultimately, right, if we then lose the viewing experience of that and lose the viewing experience of literally 10,000 mages farming all day long, and so we get people in the world mining, herbing, killing, PvPing, right, playing the game, I believe, as it was intended to be played, I think we'll be better off for it. I really do.
Duranasaur?
I mean, I don't know how you can disagree with North once he gets rolling like that.
So, no, I don't want to steamroll people, but right, I do. I really do.
I genuinely do love that point, that they might be just getting back to that true vanilla WoW experience, that like the game is hard, and it takes time and effort, and you can't it's not just about the min-max experience. It's, it's about the everyday and logging in. I love that. I do. And I think that a lot of my negative thoughts and feelings about, the announcement today has to do with what I envisioned a fresh classic being. And and having like these two thoughts, right? Of like, oh, I'm going to either do the hardcore road to rag, or I'm going to do raid speedrunning. And with these changes, both of those things are sort of have been like cut down at the knee, basically. And it's like, I don't know if either of them are even going to happen. So that is very much where my perspective comes from. So I'm
they'll
kind
happen,
of like,
though. They'll just happen differently. And that's the tough part, is letting go of some of that.
You're absolutely right. And I think already, like, the hardcore community, like Josh said, like, you could use classic era, like there's workarounds. And I think that speedrunning will probably still happen in some, degree. It's just, it's an interesting shift, for Blizzard to make, especially because I think so many of these things, especially like all the points that North's making, were things that I really wanted when Classic first came out. And so now it's like this weird thing where it's like, oh, well, we had that first version of the game, and I wanted to be able to continue to explore that and push the boundaries of that within different avenues with like player created experiences. And now it's like, oh, they're sort of taking the reins back from us, and that's going to be a hard pill to swallow.
I know it's a scary thing for like a one-off server like this, these changes that are coming through to people who absolutely, like we've been talking about, might struggle with letting go of the old ways, even if for a short period of time, so to speak. But to invoke the second Inception reference of the podcast, like I would say to you, it's like that scene where you're waiting for a train that will take you far away. You know where you hope the train will take you, but you can't know for sure. It's this leap of faith that we're taking happening with this kind of server that ultimately I really do think will be a lot of fun. But I respect a lot of the points you've raised, Duranasaur, and I understand, not like, I won't term it as hostility, but the, trepidation with which some of the really hardcore old school players might enter this kind of server. Look, North, I want to throw it back to you. Then fuck you. I'll throw it back to you, and you guys are absolutely smashing it. I just can't commend you enough for this. But I really want to ask quickly about something I raised earlier when I talked about the phase release. And like I said, about 9 weeks per phase and everything. Am I wrong to say, North, like, it's not seemingly as big an issue for me, even compacted within a 12-month release for those first few phases? But the real interesting one is that phase 5 to phase 6 progression, when you do push guilds to go into Nax with maybe only a half a dozen or so pieces from AQ.
Yeah, I think it does ramp up like exponentially there, right? Because there is so much strong gear in Encourage. A lot of it is, fairly repetitive gear, right? A lot of it's like warrior tier that does like really increase power, rogue tier that really does increase power. So I don't think it ends up being too dangerous of a problem because, you're missing some belts on your mages, you're missing some necks on your warlocks and your mages. It's not fundamentally going to change things because the tier pieces are going to drop, right? And so those tier pieces are a lot of like the power that you get from Encourage. I don't think it's fundamentally, it's not as if there's, and there are some items like this, but like given the availability of ranking weapons, given the availability of other weapons up to this point, there's not some, there's no Nelfs tier, right? In that instance, there's no mind quickening gem in that instance. There's no, dragon, DFT in that instance, right? And obviously some warrior players are going to yell at me for this, probably, some rogue players probably, but fundamentally, right? Like it's not especially different from the tiers before it. And if it stands to make it on like a little too challenging, the thing is that originally Cthulhu was much harder than the first 3 bosses of Naxxramas. So you create the situation in which, right, then you're clearing early bosses of Nax to go back to clear AQ faster, right? So you create this dynamic that is actually, much more exploratory of the raid and much more sort of, cautious in environment. It's not, okay, I've failed to kill the boss, my guild is disbanding. And I think maybe this can be hard for players to really adapt to because we're used to this, situation that Duranasaur is. If you're not smashing content, if you're not seeing the ignite up 98% of the time, if you're not seeing crit after crit after crit, right? Like you're going to be disappointed. And I think that that's a definite potential here. But I think the thing that they're trying to create, and I think that this will preserve it, right? Like the sort of legacy of Nax before will be supported by this 9-week period of AQ because then you're just thrown into Nax with not that much gear, a good amount, but not that much gear, and you're left to do what, right? You've got 9 warriors maybe could have gotten their tier pieces for that week, so it's not the full 20-man squad anymore. It's not the full 25-man squad if you're running that many warriors, right? So you create this difficulty curve. I hope, right, that preserves the original sort of sanctity of Naxxramas and this mystique of Naxxramas in effort, right, through other changes as well to create this old version of the game. The feels, right? The changes that preserving the this is a terrible term for it, but the mouth feel of vanilla, right? And there's no other way to describe it really. It's the environment. Exactly. Right? Because, and I think even if it fails, even if this experiment fails, because, maybe it is, right? And that trepidation, I'm not gonna invalidate it. It's valid. Blizzard makes mistakes. Blizzards make a lot of mistakes, right? But their backs are really against the wall this time. So if they're gonna succeed, it needs to be now. And I think that they're finally recognizing the things that make their game good. And I think that they're like this is such for me, again, fills me with joy because even if it fails, even if it ultimately is for naught, even if this experience ultimately is worse than the original classic, I don't think that will be, even if it is, right, it will have been worth the try. It will have been worth the optimism, right, to try and preserve this gold thing, this nugget of truth at the center of it, just in terms of what makes MMOs and this kind of experience fun. And I think that thing is worth living for. I think that thing is worth fighting for. And I think that thing is worth dying for. And I think that they need that joy that they can convey to the people that play their game. I don't think there's anything more important than that for Blizzard to evoke in this experiment. And I think that there's a chance of it. Even if it's small, even if it's minuscule, I will hold on to that optimism because it few things make me happy, but that makes me overjoyed.
Jesus, I am feeding off of your energy right now. I've got all these famous speeches that I'm thinking of right now, and I'm going to invoke another speech. I feel like, fucking, that was Day-Lewis in Last of the Mohicans. Like, it's fucking pumping me up. I love it. All right. Fuck you. Let's throw it over to you, mate. While North's getting everyone pumped up. Let me just
Yes.
sort
I
of
can
frame
bring
this
us
one
down.
for you.
That's fine.
Mate, sort of piggybacking off of what North just said, I'd sort of ask, and guys, God, you're in so much trouble. Like, if you have to go, please do let me know, because I've got a fair bit I do want to still talk about. But, look, with regards to the raids, FAQ, you know, I think North raises a lot of great points there, and I'm very excited about sort of that mystique and difficulty being perhaps restored to Classic as well. The one thing I would ask, though, is now bringing in this element of boss difficulty, like I sort of raised about 20 minutes ago, because I asked Duranasaur, hey, you know, is there a reality in which, you know, classic content actually does get more difficult? Or like Kef Tank is saying what I said about 20 minutes earlier as well, is this just a redressing of basically asking people for more of their time? Like, it's not really, it's an illusion of being more difficult when really it just takes 2 to 3 minutes longer to kill. Now, Blizzard has already said, like they sort of hinted at with TBC as well, and what they've done with TBC is, you know, bringing back elements or mechanics of bosses that perhaps they'd scrapped early on in Classic, and in order to make the game more difficult to scale with our, you know, proverbial skill level with the game. Do you think it's possible that they can make Classic more difficult, or it's just not going to happen?
The fact that they have compressed the schedule and removed world buffs is definitely going to ramp up the difficulty for the collective output, healing output and DPS output that you can have. And that's the part that I think is going to stick in some people's craw real bad. I think that AQ and Nax in particular are going to be tough for groups that don't have optimized healers and don't have healers who know really well what they're doing. I was in a fairly, active and pushing guilds on the Horde side, and we were always short of healers. And when our good healers left for greener, faster pastures, it devastated our morale. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is where is the attrition flow going to go? Because now if you've got that mace, that Cthulhu mace, you are suddenly the hottest property in the world going into Nax, where they say, look, we love you. You've been with us the whole time, but we got to clear this boss and we need that healing power that this person has. So there is going to be a difficulty curve in terms of the numbers. So they've tweaked the numbers because they can't make the encounters more difficult mechanically for all kinds of reasons that we discussed. Yes, you're going to see some extra phases that you didn't see, and you're going to have to repeat those phases a few more. So you're going to have to dance better. You're going to have to anticipate what the suns are going to do. So those things are more likely to happen. Maybe the numbers will be so whacked that they'll just blow right through it and won't be a problem. But it is certainly because you are not getting a huge mass, this unwieldy fist that is 40 people in a classic raid and doesn't need the fine tuning for most of the content the way that 25-mans do for the rest of the game. You're going to lower the potency and speed of that fist, which means you're going to have to be punching more and for longer, which means more time for mistakes. And that's what really kills most players in Classic, because the biggest mechanic, quite honestly, is threat. And so, or, you know, not being in the right place at the right time and not dying. So if you die, if you pull threat, those are the mistakes that are more likely to make the more time that you have. And it's tougher for other people to cover for you. So I think it's going to inherently make these raids more challenging, because there's going to be a smaller pool of players that are going to be able to execute at that level for that amount of time consistently if the numbers are so low. And again, it's tough to know what those numbers are going to be like with unlimited dots, unlimited debuff slots, and no world buffs and consumes. I'm sure somebody's going to run the numbers on a private server at some point and have those answers. But I think it's going to be it's going to mute the base power that has been accumulated over 15 years of data mining and testing and number crunching on what that 40-person fist can do. So that's going to make it tougher. And you're not going to be able to sit on an instance forever and get all this catch-up gear and have a big roster, a huge bench of people that are ready and willing and able to come in. That's going to be the part that I would be most curious to see, is between months 4 and 8, what the attrition curve will do to people and to guilds.
Another interesting point, sort of while we're talking about receiving the proverbial fists from bosses in this game, is I think North might have mentioned this one earlier as well, is in terms of classic content remains relevant throughout the lifespan of the game. We just saw that in what we went through. People are still, for the most part, as far as I'm concerned, tell me if I'm wrong, running Molten Core for, one or two very good items, even when Nax is out and things like that. I do wonder, with the shortened cadence, that becomes even more relevant, where fewer members of your raid got those really, really amazing one or two items, whether it's, your mind quickening gem from BWL or whatever, or, the druid healing shoulders from fucking, what's his face in Molten Core? Major Domo, yeah. That's the guy. We're going to have, as far as I'm concerned, the hardcore guilds needing to do Molten Core, BWL, AQ, and Nax all within a given week, aren't we? Or am I crazy?
Yeah, I'm sure they'll continue doing that. Cause I think to your point, most guilds, at least through AQ40, were still clearing Molten Core every week. And then when Nax came out, I think a lot of guilds dropped Molten Core, at least like guilds that had been clearing Molten Core forever, and they didn't really, there was like, one or two pieces total for their entire 40 people that they still needed out of there. But yeah, with this abbreviated schedule, I don't think there's ever going to be a time where there aren't useful pieces out of older content.
Well, they'll still be chasing Thunder Fury. Like, they've had their Thunder Fury timeline significantly chopped down.
Right, which again makes that, right, like when you don't have months and months and months of these phases, right? You add some mystique back, right? Like you really do add some mystique back when you don't see legitimately every fucking warrior in Stormwind and Ironforge and Ogrimmar with the Thunder Fury, right? And you don't see that anymore. It's not, we've recruited 8 Thunder Furies from the attrition of the other, because it's, so many people are quitting because it lasts so long. And there's not much to do because the novelty of it decreases. But if you increase that difficulty, right? If you try and preserve that older feeling, the novelty goes up because people are like, well, I'm a Shadow Priest now, but I can use my dots. I'm an Affliction Warlock and I can use my dots. I'm a Hunter and I can Serpent Sting again. Right, like things are fundamental. Like there is a novelty that is created there, and then it's like, okay, well, what does the speedrunning meta look like? Does it have a bunch of hunters in it? Are hunters now more important because of these new mechanics? Because warriors don't have as much as they do. Because hunters, especially in later patches, right, especially from AQ on, are actually doing a good amount of damage if you don't encounter how much they lose from not having a world buff sort of privilege like the warriors do, and having that exponential ramp up in damage.
Well, let's go down that garden path now, because you guys have danced around it a little bit, and I've really enjoyed the sort of light touches you've made on the class specifics. But let's talk about it now, sort of, as FarQ and I have talked about many times, privately and on the show. Like I said, my greatest hope was Blizzard sort of tapping the sign in the office, break the meta, and the removal of world buffs and the increase in the debuff slots has absolutely done that already. Straight away, first step into these servers, the meta has been broken. Warriors are not the same. Warlocks can apply all their fucking debuffs. Hunters throwing in Serpent Sting.
Can dot, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. All of these
Rupture can be on the bosses.
Absolutely. So let me throw it out to you, ravenous wolves, to sort of, do a half-baked, off-the-cuff theory crafting of your own. When I say, which class has the most to, now I'll half answer before I let you go in, because I think I know. Which class has the most to gain from this new meta on the face of it, and which class has the most to lose? Because for me, the obvious answer seems to be warlocks have the most to gain, given that they can throw out all their dots now and just go willy-nilly and fucking go ballistic. I respect North. You're 100% right. Hunters will absolutely benefit from this. However, I'm happy to be corrected, guys. My understanding is Serpent Sting still only tickles for the most part. So it definitely raises their DPS, but whether it brings them to the cream of the crop, I'm not necessarily sure.
You might be forgetting Hunter's Mark, my friend. Could never put that up.
Oh, very good. Of course. All right. Well, North, you kick us off. Who's the biggest winner? Who's the biggest loser of this?
I think the biggest loser is Warrior, right?
Warriors, no hands down.
Yeah. No, Warriors are the biggest loser. I'm curious as to what people think, because there are different metrics here. I think the biggest winner, honestly, in terms of overall net shift, is either Warlock or Hunter, right? I don't think they'll be at the top. I don't think either of them will be at the top, ever, right? But I think that's the biggest net shift. I think Rogues and Mages will be at the top. So right, like when we talk about the biggest winner from this, is the biggest winner the person who's now on top, or is the biggest winner the person who's now benefited the most, who does more damage, right? So like those
Yeah,
those
why
different
not
metrics I
both?
think are interesting, right? Well, you know, why not both? I think that hunters, because of the way that world buffs worked, right? Because they do benefit warlocks, especially in terms of when they're shadow, not affliction. So affliction warlocks maybe benefit the most because they actually can put their dots up. So affliction warlocks couldn't do anything before. Now they can do everything, right? So affliction probably benefits the most in terms of change. But hunter gets their attack power, and a lot of world buffs, especially for, right, like the largest duration of classic, didn't even the ones that said they gave ranged attack power didn't give ranged attack power.
Yeah, until they
So-
scaled it later on.
Exactly, right? And so a lot of those base stats don't really help hunter all that much. So I think in terms of a difference, right, because other classes are gaining so much from world buffs, and hunters don't gain that much, and hunters gain from the fact that they now have the dots on, or, you know, Serpent Snake's not that big of a deal, but now they get, Hunter's Mark, right? Because of that, because these fights are now longer and hunters aren't particularly mana intensive in classic, because they don't have steady shot, right? They're not spending that much mana. It's mostly auto shots and multi shots. And I could be wrong, I'm not a hunter player. But, you know, because of that change in the meta, it could be that hunters benefit the most, I think, potentially.
Two quick questions for you before I throw it to the other two guys. Firstly, on your warrior point, I'll speak up for Keftank here, because Keftank did say earlier in Twitch chat something that got me intrigued, where he was like, well, you know, think of all those moments that, you know, the raid unfortunately wiped in Classic and all your world buffs were removed. Weren't warriors still at the top of the pile even after that situation? So would they not still be, you know, in a position of power here in Classic without world buffs? Do you think there's some truth to that or not?
I think there is, right? I think they still will be very strong, but also you have to figure the raid is being designed around the warrior at that point, right? The raid is being, you know, sort of, you know, the raid for the large part, even when there's wipes, there's not everyone's wiping typically, you know, it's a couple people dying. So for the cases of full wipes, 100%. But I didn't have a lot of those, so I can't really speak to them as readily. Maybe other people can, right? No, but a lot of times, right? Like you're able to get out, right? Like, you know, you're able to get out in some way, and not everyone dies because the content is really that easy in a lot of cases, right? Even when you're getting like Neff breathed, you know, not like, you know, in random situations, it's really only like BWL, people missing taunts and stuff, you know, on the dragons that's really going to wipe your entire raid. And those are, you know, in a good guild, few and far between. So I can't really speak to that per se, but what I expect is warriors will still be very, very strong, but especially when you're not given that much time in between the phases, if they're not ranking, they're much, much weaker, right? Because they're so dependent on their weapons. They're dependent on their rage gen. They're dependent on that gear that they won't have in Massa anymore. Right. And so
Josh,
these longer phases.
To kind of,
go ahead.
To take a casual phrase on it, we, at the end, when we were in AQ and getting into Nax, we were recruiting and it was like, well, a warrior with no gear is pretty much better than anything else that we can get at this point. Like that was literally what it became because of the class and the world buffs. If you don't have those weapons, you are not going to be able to compete as well. And you probably won't have been playing the game as much and you won't be as skilled or experienced. So looking at bench recruiting, the big glut of warriors is saying, well, I want to get into a raid. What should I do right now? Well, roll a shaman if you're horde, roll a warrior if you're everything else. And that probably will shrink. I have to agree with North. Hunters become much more important and compelling now. They become much more playable because there were three of them. You needed trank shot rotation and you had one guy that pulled. And that was it. They were really cool for leveling up. They were really cool for farming. They were the tribute DMT, staple. If that, the DMT stuff is out of the way, you might have 4 hunters. It might not be we've got 3 hunters and we're just taking up space if you come and take a slot. If you've got 5, 6, 7 warlocks, then there's a real appeal for a shadow priest. A lot of guilds carried one anyway for the locks, but is 2 possible? Who knows? But it does at least make it more in the viability range so that the things that pushed it towards warriors means that if you had 10,000 people, you had a big chunk of them where they basically said, well, if I play these classes, I won't get to do this content and no one's going to want me. Everybody wants these things. I'm just going to go that way. So it probably will introduce more class flexibility. Hunters and locks are 2 of the ones that benefit the most from this. I do think that I agree with North that rogues and mages are going to be on top eventually. Warriors, if they rank, are going to be really nasty and important early on. So you're going to have these guilds with a bunch of warriors, but you better believe that they're thinking progressively and hardcore. They are going to have an ult that is reasonably well geared with whatever they can get in the extra raid that they run or the alt raid that they run. in other caster classes or melee class like a hunter, lock, a mage, so that they are able to contribute later when their power starts scaling down without those buffs. So I have to agree that hunters and locks become more beneficial because their viability increases. So the shift is bigger their way.
Very well said.
I think the thing to focus on that as well, like just as a quick aside, right? Like it's the question that you asked me, and I couldn't really think of it at the time, but I'm thinking of it now, right? Obviously in a raid where, you have one mage and one warlock, even if you wipe, of course, the mages, right, they scale on each other. They scale on the Winter's Chill, the Improved Scorch, the Ignite Rolling, right, the ISB for the Warlocks, right? They like that uptime, having more of them does more damage, right? Like, so they scale off each other in the same way that when we have more warriors, right, like you have, less people have to demo shout per person, less people have to sunder, less people have to, use battle shouts. So you get more people using their resources for damage. So when you begin to stack that class and you cater to that class, obviously, even if they lose their buffs, your entire comp has, in PWL and speedrun, maybe you have one mage, maybe you have two mages, and maybe you have one, maybe two warlocks, right? That means the uptime on Curse of Elements is really low. That means the uptime on all these other debuffs is really, really low. So it does favor the warriors when you begin to look at Shadow Priests, right? Maybe one, maybe two, God forbid, to get the uptime really high on certain fights. Who knows? Maybe that's the new meta. It probably won't be, but it'll at least one in later phases. AQ and beyond will probably be the meta. It might even make, if they make some other minor changes to Boomkin somewhat viable, because you hit this, you have breakpoints for warlocks and mages where, maybe they don't get the gear that they can because of the truncation of the phases, but they need those crit breakpoints for ISB and Ignite uptime. Well, where can we get free crit, right? Maybe another mage, sure, but if you don't have that option available to you, it makes Moonkin a lot more appealing. Obviously, there may be other changes. By itself, it wouldn't work. But, with a small amount of tweaking, it could bring them to a state that isn't terrible. And I think that's what's so interesting about this.
All good. Hey, fuck you. You've got to leave us, man. Thank you so much for dropping in. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's been my pleasure, Josh. Thanks for having me, guys. Have fun.
Yeah, it's been nice meeting you, man. Cheers.
Yeah, no, fuck you's the best, mate. You'd really like him, North. He's a great fucking guest.
I mean, everyone that I've encountered on your show, more or less, has been brilliant, but him especially as well.
Duranasaur, let me throw it over to you because, North raised something that I think is really worthy of conversation as well in terms of when we talk about the meta, we're not necessarily just talking about the top of the meters. We might also be talking about such significant changes to gameplay or rotations within a new raiding environment that certain specs or classes now become, fucking God forbid, more fun. And, fuck you, just before you left, raised things like the Druid. And, I'm wondering what other classes or specs, sure, the Hunter gets to throw in a Serpent Sting to the rotation now and throw up the Hunter's mark. Yeah, okay, that's good, but I'm wondering if there's something a little bit spicy in that. And obviously, again, the answer might be the Affliction Warlock actually rolling dots and having that super dot management now be a part of their gameplay. That sounds really fun, and it's a significant change for them. But is there anything else? Like I said, I've got no experience with Druids or anything, but like Keftank's joking about the Paladins dropping a Consecrate and things like that. Like, where do you think, other fun changes are for classes and specs with no debuff limit?
So I actually do want to hit on hunters because I'm a hunter guy,
sure,
through and through. And as much as I would love for hunters to end up being like a lot better, I actually don't think they're going to do a ton better even in this situation. Like I think a good hunter, even in classic, even with world buffs, was able to do really, really well. And I think if you remove world buffs, they still do okay. But I also think the big thing that people probably aren't thinking of when it comes to hunters and debuff slots is the 8 of 8 tier 2 bonus, which is it's a debuff that can stack for every single hunter that has the 8 of 8 tier 2. And you can apply multiple, and it's 450 range attack power. So theoretically, if you were to stack like 5 or 6 hunters and they all had 8 of 8 tier 2, the proc rate wasn't great, but if it did all proc, they would all start hitting for pretty astronomical amounts of damage. So there's that fun piece, because that was something where even our guild, like at a certain point, it was like, hunters, you cannot wear that full set because it's a debuff slot.
I love it. See, that's the kind of shit that I love hearing now, because again, back to tapping the sign of breaking the meta, already just like off the cuff, without even really devoting much deep diving on it. we're coming up with things that will be completely different. And I fucking it gets me excited. I love that. North, you were oohing and ahhing through that. Any other things
sick.
that you can think of? Yeah.
The 25 hunter raid is now, right, like that's now the dream, right? Like that's sick. Right, never wipe, feign death every wipe. Who cares? But no, I think that's so interesting. I really do think that that's so interesting, and I think that really like we'll see so much cool stuff. Locke obviously, is a big winner there. Being able to put up their dots, but it comes down right like paladins, right, like get to actually consecrate because consecrate was a hidden debuff slot, right? Like that's such a fucked up thing that it was a hidden debuff slot. Like what is that? Like that's awful. And now it's corrected, right? It's corrected in a very major way. And I think that that's so interesting that they get to actually play more. They get to judge wisdom more, right? They get to judge light more, right? So you have these other, viable options of actually getting to press your buttons in meaningful ways. Right. And I think that's just so, I think it's brilliant, right? I really do think it's brilliant, right? You can swing Nightfalls now because it's not pushing off important buffs, right? Maybe you hit a rend when you have low uptime on a boss and you're going away and you just dump some rage, right? So it makes these other abilities so much more, it lets you press more buttons and ultimately, maybe that's not, it's not changing your class in such a fundamental way. Maybe it's not making up for the fact that Warrior loses so much about how it wants to play, right? Warrior does fundamentally with these changes play so much different, and really for the negative, I think. And maybe that doesn't make up for that, right? Like, and then that would be the only sort of, right, like really twinge of sadness I have about this. But I think that it's probably net positive. I think like, right, Shadow Priests being able to use their stuff more readily and not being these weird, cuck specs where, they're, just half healers, half not. Hopefully it erases that because I think that's less fun, right? Hopefully it creates a situation in which you can have, maybe a balance shirt is worth it. Probably not, but maybe it is. I would really want them to try and encourage that. Maybe a paladin, God forbid you gave them a taunt, right? And maybe upped the spell power scaling on Consecrator, added something here or there. Maybe what you do is you add an idol available in Molten Core that, maybe not Molten Core, maybe in Skullomance or something, maybe something farmable that makes it so that Fairy Fire, when you're in Boomkin form, does what it does in TBC. Maybe it adds 1% hit, maybe it adds 2, maybe not 3, but maybe like 1 or 2% hit to make things more viable, to switch things up, to add some sort of love to these classes in ways that doesn't fundamentally take, a lot of design work and a lot of nonsense. Right, so I think that there are these avenues to make it even further worth, right? Because then you create the Boomkin dynamic of, well, they have to keep up the Fairy Fire, and they also are keeping up Insect Swarm and Moonfire, right? And so you get these good dynamics that start to arise again that I think are more interesting than otherwise, right? Like having your corruption up as Warlock is just fundamentally more fun, I think, than only ever pressing Shadow Bolt, and I think most people would agree with that.
Agreed. I remember rating late classic as a warlock and like having to have the chat about when I, if I can or cannot, or when I do and do not use corruption. And I was like, it blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean I can't fucking use corruption? Like, this is bizarre. Anyway, Duranasaur, I'll ask you the same question, even though we might have already sort of mostly answered for you. I'm not sure if in your previous responses, biggest winner and loser of this one.
I think DPS Warrior is the biggest loser, but I don't even think they're going, like we've said, they're not going to the bottom. I think that a DPS Warrior that's in like equal tier gear, of their like counterpart DPS is probably still going to be as good, if not better than them. I think that it's just that good of a class, especially if you're still doing like Fury Prot and you're allowing the threat ceiling to be super high. I think DPS Warrior, while they lose a lot, are still going to be up there. And then, big winner. It's so hard to not just go straight to Warlock because they have such a toolkit that they never get to use in raids, with all their dots, with the drains, with everything that that will be a fun thing to see, right? That's something that not even the negative Nancy of the podcast for the day can say that, is going to be a bad time. I think that it's going to be super cool to see how the meta unfolds with the unlimited debuff slots.
Oh, good. On that one, North, I am sort of really intrigued by the potential of the Affliction Warlock. And, you've already said rogues. We haven't really talked about rogues much. And I know I've got a lot of rogue listeners who will want to touch on that slightly, but like rogues being able to apply all their poisons now is obviously a big thing. I'm not sure, and the rogues can shout me down, if rogue gameplay is changed necessarily. I don't think whether or not they get an extra button or two to push, but certainly applying poisons to their weapon and everything and doing all that stuff.
Well, rupture for one, right? Like openers can be different, right? Because you have unless you're daggers, you have no real opener as a sword rogue. Now you get to garrote on an open. So, and I don't know what the garrote scaling is like. I didn't play in vanilla, but certainly in later versions of the game, that was what you would do in Wrath as a sword rogue. If you, for whatever reason, if you didn't think you'd have to use your vanish, and I could have just been, I'm really bad at the game, but I believe that this is what you wanted to do, was vanish and then garrote immediately because it was relatively, and again, I might be remembering it wrong, but I thought it was relatively low energy and fairly high damage for what you were getting, right? So it adds this interesting dynamic back where, you do actually get that, and maybe they add Mangle to Feral Druids to give them something else, right? To like increase the bleed damage. I think that would be a good change to sort of pass forward in this version of the game. I think that would be really, really interesting. Maybe they don't do it this time. Maybe they do it, the next time, or maybe never at all. But I think it would be interesting to look at because it would encourage these other buttons. It would encourage these more complex rotations. It would let you press more of your buttons for more skill expression. I think to that point as well, Warrior Warrior loses a lot. They do lose a lot, but they also gain something. And what they gain is they, and some people are going to shout me down for this and say that I'm an idiot. And this is kind of stupid. So fair.
You're an idiot.
Heroic strike queuing becomes substantially more difficult and a much more readily indicative aspect of skill expression. And for people who aren't aware of what it is, essentially, when, and I hope most people know what it is, but when you queue up Heroic Strike and you attack with your offhand, usually it would have a chance to hit as if you're dual wielding, which is very, very negative. This is stolen from D&D when you have a lower chance when you're dual wielding weapons to hit with those weapons to encourage people using one weapon at a time, right? Unless you had various talents, yada yada, blah 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 blah. But with this change, right, with the way Warrior works on Classic, when you're using Heroic Strike and your offhand hits, it hits far more often, right? It hits as if it's a yellow strike, as if it's a Heroic Strike, and so. If you don't have the rage to sustain that because you need to whirlwind, because you need a bloodthirst, et cetera, right? You might not want to spend the rage on it. So you queue up Heroic Strike, attack with your offhand, it has the increased chance to hit, and then you immediately unqueue Heroic Strike so that the main hand doesn't consume the rage. And so that becomes a much more viable strategy, obviously, just purely based on the fact that you are that you don't have the rage to sustain Heroic Strike nearly as much. So I think that's interesting, personally.
I meant to say, it might just be feedback. It's not a big deal at all, mate. Have you got a desk fan or something running?
No, people have been telling me there's buzzing in the background of my stuff lately, though.
It's funny.
I'm going to look at that soon.
It's a bit of mic feedback, but it sounds like you're just sitting there wanking while talking about Classic Fresh the whole time, which, you know what? I'm okay with if that's what you need to do. It's exciting news.
Well, I've got news for you, Josh.
Oh, you fucking degenerates. I love it. All right, look. It sounds like a pen clicking as well. It might have been that instead. Look, guys.
That might have just been my keyboard sounds really weird.
Right. No, it's all good. I'm more laughing. Don't worry about it, mate. It's not a big deal. What I was going to say was, North, just quickly in terms of mages, you sort of intimated that you think mages will still be basically at the top of the pile, and I'm presuming it's because they sort of maintain the status quo while everyone else get things taken away to a certain extent. But
there's things taken away for sure. But
okay,
everyone else gets,
what?
Everything that's taken away is taken away more so from other people, right? So
right.
Rogue is in the same bucket as well, where they don't exponentially scale with haste like Warrior does for more Chief's Blessing, etc. Or with attack power, they don't do more damage and then get more energy. That's not how it works, at least in vanilla. And so Mage is the same way, right? They don't, especially early on, they don't do more damage and therefore then get more damage to do more damage, with the exception of how Ignite works. But you can fix Ignite by having more mages. So it doesn't, in reality, it doesn't really matter. You're not losing. There's no spell power world buffs. Well, there are, but they are like they're not really commonly used, and they're not actually like they don't stack with like consumes and stuff. And so you maintain your Flask of Supreme Power, which is this huge advantage. And you're not losing nearly as much as anyone else, right? So you're not losing all that attack power, you're not losing all that spell power, you're losing some intellect, and you're losing crit chance, but that's it. Right?
So it's not necessarily a lock that pardon the pun, a lock that the Affliction Warlock would be basically taking that number one spot.
No. I don't think that they would. I think Warrior would still be above. It depends on how things works, honestly. Like I'm not sure how much damage. Like I don't think anyone's ever tried to drain life like siphon life, drain life, corruption, agony, a boss.
Yeah.
I've never seen it done. I don't know how much damage that does.
With
I have no
full
clue.
consumes and like a Curse of Shadow and like a Shadow Priest and everything. Yeah, no idea what.
No clue how much damage that does. It might do a lot of damage, but it's sacrifice. It takes so much from the raid. It normally just slurps up. Otherwise, very useful resources for all the melee and the other casters. And so it's never been done. I'm sure someone could do the math, but I'm just not sure how much damage it would do. But I think it would do a good amount, but I don't think it would be more than a warrior early on. Their Prebus is very, very strong. Lock Prebus, Mage Prebus is very, very weak. So early on, the melee are really going to shine. That you're not going to see a difference there, I don't think, generally speaking. But in terms of later on, when the Mage gear and the Warlock gear gets much better, when they get those hit rating sort of breakpoints that they need. And they get that, more crit for more ISB uptime. If you have enough of them for ISB uptime, if you have enough mages. And so it's a funny thing with Warlock, right? You get smoother ISB uptime and it gets slightly higher, but it doesn't really actually increase that much because you're consuming more when you have more, if you're familiar with how improved Shadow Bolt works. So like it puts in a certain number of stacks, whereas Mage just, it has diminishing returns when you have too many, but more and more you put to it, the more and more Ignite uptime you have, right? So Mages scale better in that way, where you can kind of just compensate for the loss in world buffs with more mages. You can't do the same thing with locks. You can't do the same thing with really any other class. Maybe there's an argument for Hunter with the tier 2 set, but it's going to be really hard to get 8 of 8 and short lockouts. So it's going to be really interesting to see, and that's the thing that I am first and foremost curious about how these shifts go. I think that eventually Fire Mage will just be dominant, really to a fault. Warlock will be close behind. And then Rogue will be third. I think will be the way that we eventually see it shipped out in late AQ and early Nax, which I think is when this damage is going to matter the most. So I think that's how it's going to shift out. But early on, I think Warriors and Rogues are going to be strong, with Mages trailing behind, obviously, and Warlocks behind that. But I could be wrong, right? It could be that the base damage from Drain plus maybe the Warlocks go for your tier 1 this time, because tier 1 has a Drain set bonus on it. I don't think a lot of people know that. It's a Drain life set bonus on it that makes it do an enormously larger amount of damage, and so it's really great for Soul Link specs because you just drain people all day long. It's really, really dope for that, and it could be the filler in the Affliction rotation because of how much hit rating you get extra from just the Affliction talents by themselves. So that could be worth it in and of itself, because that's also contributing to Nightfall procs and just free damage. When especially we have a low crit, the other Warlock specs with Ruin, the increased crit modifier become a lot worse because you don't have as much crit. So I think we're in for a really, really, really fun shakeup of the meta. I really do.
One thing I'll raise as he's going, a point by Kev Tank that I wanted to throw out to you two guys, because I wasn't aware of this, and he's saying that the loss of world buffs and sort of generally just the slots, the buff slots is also something to take into consideration in terms of, he's saying the loss of world buffs means you can flex in other buffs that warriors generally didn't take due to the buff cap being, things like Cloudkeeper leg plates. I'm not super familiar with the buff cap because, I was fucking lazy casual who didn't run around and gather that many buffs. With the buff cap and what he's raising, do you guys think that again, there's a meta shifting thing coming there?
I don't think it'll adjust too much. I think the big thing would be HOTS, honestly, like on your tank, and off tanks and stuff, because usually your tank has the most buffs, right? Your tank is the one that's putting up literally everything down to like a fortitude pot. And one of the things that I think most top guilds said was healers, you're never allowed to throw up HOTS on the tanks because you're going to push off their buffs. So I think it's a good question of, does getting rid of world buffs open up enough of those buff slots, or is that something that they might also get rid of, the buff cap? Because if they just get rid of the buff cap, then there's no question of it. You can have all the HOTS you want, you can have all the random little buffs you want, and there's no worry about it. But if it stays in there, then yeah, I think it does open up some space. But I think that there are still scenarios where your main tank could end up losing a mongoose or something substantial if all the HOTS are thrown on them and ancestral inspiration is procced and all that stuff.
Okie dokie. Hey, look, on the mage thing, we've invoked the term a couple of times now of mage boosting, and there was a follow-up post from Kaivax about this very point outside of the main page about the season of mastery, where he did throw out that they're taking a look at mage boosting. That's all he said. Didn't say they're removing it, didn't say specifics, just said, we are taking a look at mage boosting for WoW Classic Fresh. Look, it goes without saying, as North has already hammered home, that this has just been one of the biggest bugaboos about WoW Classic, that it seems like just the vast, vast majority of people absolutely, I really think they want this out of the game. I don't think it's crazy for me to say the vast majority of people want this out of the game. I know some people like it, but I just feel like it's not particularly close when we weigh up how many voices are saying get rid of it and how many voices are saying keep it. So I'll just, again, first in best dress, guys, I'm all for it. Even though, and North, you'll be happy to know, I'm more than likely joining the ranks of the mages in WoW Classic Fresh. I don't care. Like, this will not sway my decision on choosing a mage. I'm all for it.
Nor
Do you
should
think
it.
it's a good thing?
Oh, I think it's brilliant. And this is when, right, I reveal to you the next phase of my, master plan. First it was, some changes. Next it was Team Elevator. Now, right, I'm coming out fully in support of literally every single dungeon. And I know that you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to offer the solution anyway. I'm going to offer the answer to the question. Every single dungeon in World of Warcraft, without exception, should offer 0 XP in every situation. When you enter a dungeon, it should give you 0 XP no matter what. The quest XP should be raised substantially. The quest XP should be raised from every single dungeon quest without exception. Doubled, tripled, I don't care, right? But any XP in a dungeon, the second you walk into a dungeon, you kill a mob, nothing happens to your XP bar. And that is the best, simplest, and most elegant way to fix this fucking problem.
Hey,
Of
North,
course it should be fixed. It's the best, that's the best way to fix it. But the fixing this is brilliant. It's brilliant in so many ways, because sitting alone in an instance for hours and hours and hours and hours and encouraging players to min-max the fun away in those areas is just so bullshit.
mate, you wouldn't know this, but I really like spicy food, right? And that fucking spicy meatball that you just dropped, oh, that fucking muy caliente, I fucking love it. I love it. I think that's a really fun suggestion. Like, people would be up in arms about hearing that, but like, I get where you're coming from. And
no spell cleave? No spell cleave unlocks. You have to go into the world and do it in a quest.
And you just go to dungeons for the gear.
Yeah, and you do dungeons for the gear, and you don't sit there and you cope around. Imagine now as well, right? Like, you get all this, you get the bonus XP from the dungeon quests, Josh, and you go into BRD, and it's double XP from quests. So now instead of BRD being 1 level from all the quests, it's like 2.5 or more levels from turning in all the fucking quests in BRD. That's the best fucking thing that would happen because of this.
Look, and Booth raises a really interesting point where I really like how spicy you've taken it there. But then there is the legitimate argument over how far would you have to go to legitimately kill off mage boosting? Because Booth is saying, hey, look, I mean, maybe you wouldn't even have to go that far. Maybe a 50% reduction to dungeon experience would be enough to kill off mage boosting. Though. Yeah. Here's the problem, and I'm going to get right in front of it, right? And this is the reason why it's so drastic. I've thought this through, right? 50%, right? You reduce anything by other than if it's not 95% or higher, people will still boost. Yeah. They'll just do it, and they'll just do it, and it'll be AFK, it'll be really, really niche, and it'll be a lot less common. You cannot murder it. You cannot kill it. You cannot smother it in the crib unless there's a 0% XP gain in dungeons. But if you smother it in the crib, if you get there and you fucking kill it in the cradle, right? Like, then there's no more discussions, no more mages sitting there streaming for 15 goddamn hours being like, oh, look, I'm doing streaming of me AoE farming, come learn. And everyone's like, wow, you're a mage and I want to know how to press Blizzard. Should I have Netherwind 5-piece? What nature resistance should I get for this No, none of it. None of it. Everything dies. And it would be beautiful. It would be elegant and wonderful. Yeah, I mean, again, Booth is mentioning, boosting has always been a part of the game. And I think that we've kind of touched on that point before you arrived, Booth, into the stream. Like, I just view this as a different experience. And like, just because it's always been part of Classic doesn't mean it needs to be part of this, season of mastery that we're calling it. This is the alternate universe. This is something different. Just because it's been a part of Classic in the past doesn't mean it needs to be a part of this. I don't know. I'm full on board with team changes here. But anyway, Duranasaur, let me throw it over to you. on the boosting thing, do you think this is a no-brainer for Blizzard, or it's something that, just leave it?
Do exactly what North said, and then instead of allowing us to level faster, cut XP gain, and you get less XP from quests and mobs as you level. Put people in the open world forever and always.
Happy days. All right.
I think there are better ways to put people in the world later, but I'm not sure.
That's an exaggeration, but
yeah.
I think boosting is inherently bad for the game. I don't think there's any benefit from it. I think that it only causes negativity in the long run. So anything that they can do to limit it or get rid of it, I am behind.
And I think that other ways, right? People are suggesting, changing mob pathing. That would be very complicated. It would cause other changes in the game. Limiting mage, capping AoE, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there are all these suggestions that are made that have holes in them, right? Like, and that when you fix these problems, other problems arise, right? Slave pens, they try to fix the slave pens boost. And then the mages made it more efficient. They just found a new way to do it. And this way was better, right? So you exacerbated the problem. Exactly, right? So you exacerbate the problem unless, again, you go back in time, right? You enter your time machine and you smother the fucker in the crib, and then it just never can do anything. It doesn't do shit, right? You go in the instance, it hurt. Maybe every time you kill a mob, maybe it takes away that amount of XP from your character. Maybe that's the new solution if you're not level 60. Every time there's a limited amount of mobs you can kill before you de-level. That might be the new take. I'm not sure. I'd have to mull it over a little bit, but that might be the new take as I twirl my mustache evilly.
Mate, has a baby wronged you or something? Countdown to Classic does not condone the baby murdering thoughts of our friend Norm.
Well, if you, it's the metaphorical baby, right? And maybe I'm getting flashbacks from BioShock Infinite too much when they kept spamming the line smother. But anyway, not important at all, right? Like, but I do think it's important to, right, like, to have a clean cut, right? To have a clean cut, not give, not reduce the player power of mages necessarily in terms of farming, not like, make Blizzard fucky, like, not do any of these other annoying changes, and just make it a simple change, make it an elegant change, make it one that doesn't affect player power anywhere other than in dungeon boosting, because we can all agree that is where the problem, I think, lies.
Okay, one thing we haven't touched on yet, that I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on. At the top of the show, I said that, my thinking coming into Classic Fresh, bear with me 1 second. Fuck it. The dogs would bark at whoever. My one thought coming into Classic Fresh was basically, once you do implement that truncated timeline of 12 months that, I was fully expecting with this one, and here we are. Yes, it's a thing, 12-month server. I said that I would have thought that everything time-wise would then have to go hand in hand with a change. Like we said, the leveling rates, the PvP grind, but then also, and you guys are educating me otherwise that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But one thing we haven't really talked about is drop rates, because North, I love the point that you raised, and I now have completely changed my mind on myself, where I was like, well, of course you'd have to change drop rates in raids because, people need to gear up. But I really didn't consider, you naturally make the game more difficult and restore that feeling of the old Classic and the mystique behind the raids by not giving everyone everything.
And the mystique behind the items, right? And MQG becomes a treasure, not an expectation. It's not, right? Like, you remove this expectation of gear that is created in the new version of the game, where every boss dies, where every boss is always killed, where every lockout is cleared or it's a problem, right? And I think that so good.
Well, so my presumption was now I've sort of argued against myself, and I've come out on your side, North, where I was like, well, I presume that, this is what I was saying before. I would presume that, when you kill Rag, what does Rag drop? 4 items? Like, now he's got to drop 6 because, you get fewer lockouts and it's a truncated season. But now I'm like, no, like, we don't have to do that. That's actually probably a bad thing.
Yeah, I think that it would be, right? Because it, again, sabotages what was there, right? Because in reality, these players, right, because of the, how they were progressing, because how they were discovering, the mechanics in Blackwing Lair and the mechanics, right? Like, the first players to step in Blackwing Lair and Molten Core, the first players to step in Molten Core, right? How are you supposed to know that there's a Duke off the coast of Ashara who's waiting for you to farm some mobs to take a quest from him so that you can get runes to unlock Ragnaros? How do you figure that out? That takes so long to figure out. And so naturally, right, with how the game was initially made, you lose all of these lockouts. You lose these lockouts very, very naturally. And so I think this is a better way of sort of reintroducing that, right? It's not, okay, we can't get back the mystique of having new attunements and new sort of discoveries and new quest lines and new things to discover. No, of course not. We'll have to wait for Ashes of Creation for that, later discussion. But anyway.
Guys,
but what you can do is you can mimic it, right? You can mimic the feeling, you can mimic the texture, you can mimic, right, the taste, you can mimic it, right, until you've crumbled up and textured your tofu so much that, it resembles a beef chili, right? And when you taste it and it tastes like beef chili and it tastes like classic, it tastes like vanilla, right? Like it tastes sweet and beautiful and amazing in all the ways that it needs to.
Guys, we're on the home stretch now. I won't keep you all night, but little bit more to cover. And just I wanted to ask, North has already raised a bunch of points. Duranasaur, I'll get you to open up on this one. North has already raised a bunch of points on other little changes that he'd love to see potentially come into the fold. Things maybe borrowed from TBC and whatnot that, might spice things up even further for Classic Fresh. Personally, I'm of the opinion that we probably won't get anything drastic outside of what we've heard. But in saying that, I'm asking, do you feel that through the beta process, there might be other little things that we discover they've tweaked that we haven't been told about?
I'm guessing we will, and I'm guessing that just the fact that they're doing a beta means that they might be open to doing even more, right? Like if a lot of people that participate in the beta provide the same feedback, I would not be surprised if they decided to make changes based on those suggestions, because I think it's really interesting that they're doing a beta, and I think that it just points towards them wanting to get a feel for what the community wants with this, whether I agree with the greater community as a whole or not. I think that in the end, it's probably good for them to be moving, especially if they know that it's people who are engaged with vanilla, with classic, right? If they're purely looking at people that are active on the beta and listening to those people, then those should be the people who get the most say in the changes. So yes, I do think, that they could do some more stuff.
I'm not shocked that they're doing a beta with this one, given how different it is. And obviously with things like removing the debuff limit and, raising HP levels of bosses and bringing in mechanics from, earlier iterations. As we kind of know, not to put the boot in, but Blizzard doesn't really test their own raid stuff. They leave it up to us. And, I think this is stuff that's absolutely going to have to be tested to see how it goes in terms of feel. But, I would like to hope, like you've said, that whether or not there's room for other suggestions during the beta, we'll see. Look, we'll talk about the beta as well, North, because I don't want to bury the lead. The open beta starts in 4 fucking days. October 5th. It's right around the corner. I'm very, very excited for this. People still talk about that WoW Classic beta in such revered tones. This might not be quite the same because it doesn't sound like we're getting a level 40 level cap. Obviously, they want to get us to 60. They want to get us in these raids testing bosses and whatnot. But it still might be a shitload of fun. What are you expecting of the beta, and do you think that more changes could be around the corner?
I do think there could be, and I really hope there are, right? Because when we got the feedback on the CBC beta when batching was removed, right, there was very much an outcry, especially from, some popular streamers, maybe one popular streamer in particular, that, seal twisting really should be fixed because, it makes the game that much more appealing. And I couldn't agree more with that, right? In the same way that I hope that they make changes to make, Horde and Alliance not the same, but perhaps more similar than they currently are. So that it's some of the environments maybe are a little fairer, right? Because if there are going to be changes that could prevent the faction imbalance that we saw initially, right, I'm going to support those 10 times out of 10. And I think there could be, right? Maybe, a couple of things off the head that, off the top of my head that people were really suggesting where, right, or just one thing, and again, it's not actually, it's a complete lie. It's not off the top of my head. Someone thought of it and I thought it was brilliant. Was creating you're changing Tranquil Air as a totem into a fire totem instead of an air totem. So it's not, sort of in competition with Wind Fury or with Grace of Air, when you're trying to twist that in, when you're trying to give the agility and the Wind Fury, you can't actually give your group the threat reduction. So maybe that might be something that they could consider as a means sort of to provide, a worthwhile option in terms of threat reduction for Horde that is meaningful and sort of like tries to bring things together. In the same way that I think that they should probably do the same, like they should probably add a Paladin taunt, right, to make Paladins, more useful in that situation. It could be.
Hey, you're stealing from my notes.
No, for sure, right, for sure. But I came for the first time. I came to the show with a notepad prepared, and that was one of the things that I wanted to touch on. But I think a lot of these smaller changes, and maybe they don't make all of them, right, but a lot of these smaller changes could contribute to a much better atmosphere ultimately, right? Like, I don't know if you've thought of this, but I have some lines to some Blizzard employees, and I'm trying to remind them of the things that maybe they haven't thought of. One of them that comes to mind is like level 20 Warlocks. I really hope that level 20 Warlocks is not as much of a reason for it when world buffs are removed, for sure. But I hope level 20 Warlocks can't summon. Not max level players, anyway. Because, again, it creates this degeneracy that makes the world smaller and rewards bad gameplay loops and encourages players to min-max fun away, to skip walking distances, to skip certain things that otherwise wouldn't have to. So I hope that they consider those types of things.
Give Bobby my regards next time you speak to him, by the way, mate.
Of course.
Yeah. Guys, look, I won't even really bother with the other little note of like the quality of life stuff. If anything, it's an indication that they are being open to things like, turning the summoning stones into actual summoning stones. And we already talked about the higher rate of gathering nodes, which was a suggestion that I threw to them in the content creator channel about 3 or 4 months ago when they were asking for suggestions. I said, like, I think it's fucking lame that we know where all the gathering nodes are. Like, can you just move them? And I guess their answer was not moving what they had, but just creating more of them in the name of population. But still, it's something.
And why not, right?
Yeah, I'll take
not,
it.
Right?
Absolutely. And look, guys, I'll leave you off with the easiest question and the last question, and just let's wax poetic about maybe what our dreams and visions are for our run through WoW Classic Fresh. Look, like I say, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for the last 6 weeks. I've just said that I'm joining the mage ranks. I'd ask you guys sort of what you are going to main or what you might play during the beta to mix things up. I can tell you one little thing on my end. I'm going to level 2 characters. I'm going to dual box. I'm going to have a mage and a hunter more than likely, unless this meta shifting thing makes me rethink my class selection. But the main will be a mage. I'll think about the hunter again, but I'll probably do that and just run along with an anchor and have a bit of fun because I've not done it before. I've not done the old double level. And I think it would be a bit of fun. And so main as a mage, look, I've not done it before. I'm happy to learn how to PvP. Some people were like, oh, Josh, you're not so good at PvP. Mage might not be good for you. It's high skill cap. And I'm like, oh, fuck it. It's fun. I'll go try it. And I'm used to the one button spam in raids. People are like, oh, you'll be fucking bored. You like spicy rotations. I played a warlock in TBC. I'm used to it. So how about you guys? What are your hopes and dreams? What are you going to play?
I'll probably still be trying to do the Road to Ragnaros as like my main thing, whether that happens on Fresh or Classic Era. I'm not quite sure, but my goal for that was to stick with Hunter and actually do kind of the same thing and try to level actually 2 Hunters at the same time, just cause, if one of them dies, I'd want to have a backup.
Yeah.
But yeah, outside of that, I didn't really have any other plans for Fresh, so I hope that kind of works out. I would love for Fresh to be where we do the Road to Rag. I just think that there's a lot of hype around that and a very fun experience that goes along with a Fresh launch.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. You're sort of part of the crowd, mate, and it's nice to hear. Like, when I raise it, I sort of think, people have such funny feelings about this kind of stuff sometimes. But when you go, I'll level 2 characters at the same time, a lot of people are getting back to me going, you know what, I'm fucking doing the same thing. So anyway, North, what are your plans?
Yeah, actually, I thought for this time around that, maybe I'd spice things up a little bit and, maybe like make a warlock, the affliction with all the changes that are coming to it, like maybe it could be interesting. Fuck that, man, I'm going mage! Yeehaw, brother! No, I will be going mage. Fuck every other class. I don't fucking care. I'm gonna make a rogue alt, but I'm not gonna play it. I was
gonna say, out of interest, let's say a court. You did something horrible, and as penance in a bizarre sitcom-like scenario, a court ordered that you can't play mage in WoW Classic Fresh as your punishment. What, with this new meta in mind, what class would you actually consider as a secondary option?
Not to be too bleak, but is throwing myself off a building a class? Is that not a class?
I'm behind
that's a
Baby
class.
Smotherer. Yeah.
Baby Smotherer is definitely a class. Anyway, it's called Hero of Azeroth. Anyway, it was a bit bleak. No, but I'd probably, I think if I were feeling adventurous, I would play Priest. If I were feeling nostalgic, I would play Rogue, because I don't know if I've ever talked to you about this. I'm sure I have, but my first character was a Rogue, and I played a Rogue for a very, very long time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I played a Rogue for a very long time. My first character, Northy, the female gnome rogue, was on Bailgun, the PvE server, was the auspicious start to the North saga. So.
There you go, the first step in the degeneracy.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe I'd try and reclaim some of that. I think that Rogue is very fun. I think it's hard to get used to Rogue after the changes later on, and because I especially got sort of getting good at it in like Wrath and Kata. And so you have the energy smoothing, and you have Shadow Step, and you have Cloak of Shadows. It's really hard to get used to that when you essentially any debuff will keep you out of stealth for forever, which is really annoying, I think, as Rogue. But maybe I'd give it a try. But given that I never make mistakes, and given that no court would ever order that of me, because justice is fair and honest. Yeah, I'm just gonna go mage. I love mage. Also, mage is not that hard, right? It has a high skill cap for sure, but it's not that hard to do okay on.
Yeah.
And if that's all you're after,
for me.
If that's all you're after, it's really easy, man.
Yeah, that's why I like Shadow Priest. That's why I like PvP on Shadow Priest. It's easy to be
Shadow
good.
Priest is
okay.
Shadow Priest is not even easy to be good. It's just if you press any of the buttons at any time, then you will own.
That's right in my wheel. That's right in my wheelhouse.
So mage is a step up from that. Mage is a step up from that, certainly, right? So it's a little more difficult, but not substantially. Right?
Okay.
Not substantially. Okay. You Nova a guy, you frostbolt the guy. He dies in the Nova. You celebrate. You teabag his corpse. Everyone gets home in time for dinner. Right?
Very good. Very good. Hey, real quick. Sorry, I've got to ask you about faction balance as well before I let you go. But just on that tangent, North, really quick answer. Just while I've got you as my mage, teacher here. The one thing I've been considering, and it's so inconsequential because the mobs go down so quickly anyway. If you were boxing two characters while leveling, and like I said, you got a hunter and a mage, is it a foregone conclusion that you go Frost as the mage? Because what I was thinking is basically open up with the hunter. Sorry. Let me start again. My thoughts were go Frost, open up with the Frostbolt, have the mob coming towards you slowly, and then you just spam Frostbolts and you got the hunter pew-pewing in the background. They go down in fucking 4.5 seconds and it's all good. Is that the way you do it, or is there a better way?
So I am pretty opposed to multi-boxing, so I wouldn't, but I've thought about multi-boxing before. I multi-boxed 4 mages, on Grobulus for a time before I kind of came to my senses. My chat sort of reminded me, hey, this kind of, it goes against your sort of principles in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I agreed. I think that it's ultimately purchasing player power in some way, but you're doing it on a PvE server. So it still is some form of purchasing power, but it's not nearly as egregious. That being said, I have thought about it. So for that, the hunter doesn't lose that much from just auto-shotting and having their pet on. So I would do that for sure. I would, obviously, Hunter's Mark as you're running to it. So right, you picture you're running to a mob, you Hunter's Mark, and you send your pet on it. And you get the hunter in range to auto-shot, and then the mage is still at that point running to the mob because you don't want to be blinking while leveling. That just takes too much mana. And so, yeah, as soon as you get in range, you're spamming, right? Like you maybe sting once on the hunter, if it's like a high health mob, and then you just go spam Frostbolt, and that should be fine.
Yeah. Oh no, don't get me wrong, I'm a complete and utter piece of shit. But no, I'm not playing on a PvP server, so there's not going to be any PvP shenanigans going on there. But it's mainly just because I need an alt. I need to be able to log on one day and be like, you know what, I want a different flavor, and that's what I do. But
no, for sure. And I don't think it's that. Like I think it's almost always, like the biggest and most glaring and really most problematic use of it is doing the things, as much as I love him, things that like Jerome was doing. I don't think that those are good for the game. Ultimately, it's funny and it's good for content, but it's not. I don't think it's ultimately sustainable, and I think that it promotes a sort of behavior that ultimately is deleterious to the game, especially if you have those people with those massive amounts of characters doing other things. Ultimately, what he was doing wasn't that bad, but if you have people like, farming things with it, and then manipulating the economy, right? Like it just becomes really, I think you go down a path that very, very quickly starts to abuse players. That's part of why I don't flip on the auction house anymore. Even though, right, like it is free money, and I think it's on some level fair money. I've realized that all it does is I'm not adding any value, right? I'm just taking what was there because by the virtue of the fact that I had resources before other people, I'm taking what was there and then upselling people on it. I'm not making their experience any better. I'm not farming something for them. I'm not providing a service. I'm not providing a net gain. I'm just stealing from people and justifying it because it makes my life easier. And I think that that's an unsustainable and unfair way to play the game, because if everyone was doing that, it would be substantially worse for everyone. And a player doing that in mass on my server, and I was working with him, right? We really, really ruined the economy of Stalag doing it. So I'll never do it again, because it became dangerous in a way that I don't support.
No, it's certainly not for everyone, and nor should it be. It's really I just use it as the poor man's way. It's really the poor man's boost, isn't it? Just having that anchor as you're doing the leveling process and all the quests and everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Duranasaur, let me get you to open up on our final point, mate, because I want to ask about faction balance. Look, I'm really intrigued, because some people are starting to say, look, we talk about horde fucking issues and everything in Classic and blah, 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 but, the Alliance, are they making a comeback with something like this? Because obviously we talk about the rating benefits that Alliance get that Horde doesn't get in Classic, and with this higher difficulty, perhaps that could be even more of a thing. So can you see a situation where the Alliance actually outnumbers the Horde on WoW Classic Fresh?
I actually do think that will happen, and I think it will happen because of PvP. And this is because of what I experienced on private servers. This exact same thing that happened with Classic Vanilla when it launched, when Horde was the dominant faction, and most of it seemed to have to do with PvP, and just that the average player that has any interest in PvP would just went Horde for the racials, for everything. This happened on private servers. And what would always happen is as soon as the next fresh came out, it would just flop. Right? Every single person who has any interest in PvP would then say, okay, well, if I don't want to go through that awful experience of poor queue times and an awful honor and ranking grind, I'm going to go to Alliance, because then I get the fast queues. I can actually have fun with PvP. It's not this terrible thing. And I think that's what we're going to see. I think the average person that doesn't necessarily care about faction, they're diehard people on both sides, but I think the average person that knows like they are going to PvP a certain amount is actually going to go Alliance this time rather than Horde, because they assume that they're going to get the faster queue times and they're going to have more fun with it.
North?
So I hope that they actually add some sort of benefits to Horde, and so that does not happen, because I think that that's likely to happen. I'm not sure why it's going to happen. I don't know if it's a flip-flopping, but I noticed the same thing on private servers when you had older, but it wasn't really a flip-flopping thing to me. What it was a slow burn that eventually, picked up in pace until it became, a full-on sprint towards Alliance faction imbalance. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I'm not sure what all of them are. But even from Nost to Northdale, right? When you talk about Nost, faction balance, right? It was very much Horde favored. And then you had a server afterwards you had, Chronos 2. Chronos 2 ended up being not very favored on one side. The other was relatively low population. I think it was slightly Horde favored still. And then you go over to Lightbringer, which is fairly even, I think still slightly Horde favored, but then you went onto Northdale and it was staggering. It was a breakneck sort of explosion of Alliance players, in part because of the strength of top guilds being so important, and then Progress being on the server and then quitting as early as they did sort of crumbled an already smaller faction when Apes had decided to go Alliance. So I think that there are a lot of mitigating factors. Hopefully that they add some incentives for people to go Horde, because I think that people, if they're not asleep at the wheel, will see Alliance is almost certainly better for most things, especially if that they think that they're going to get lower queue times. So I hope that they give some reasons for people to go Horde, because could be a little dicey.
Wow, I never thought we'd be here actually having suggestions thrown out there to buff the Horde. But are you mainly like PvE buffs or?
Yeah, mainly, right, like the thing that I was discussing earlier, right, if Wrath of Air, is if Tranquil Air, the threat reduction totem became a fire totem, then a lot more people would be willing to go Horde.
Fair enough.
Because most people play for PvE at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. And look, as Davis is throwing out in Twitch chat, look, yeah, server caps, things like that are always going to come up. Look, we can always dream, but I don't think that anything like that, they're just not going to do it. They know where the money's at, unfortunately. Yeah. But yeah, we can dream. Look, guys, I'm going to wind it up there. You have just, I can't thank you enough for scratching the itch for me on that one. That was 3 amazing hours of all the chat I ever could have wanted on WoW Classic Fresh in terms of this news. And God, there'll be more coming on the show, guys, in terms of, things that might develop with the meta on the beta and things like that. So we'll keep you posted. But I'll just let these, fucking lovely gentlemen go and thank them so much. Duranasaur, mate, thank you so much for taking all this time for me. And please, again, mate, I can't thank you enough for being the contrarian and you wore your heart on your sleeve and you said what you wanted to say. And, fuck us if we don't agree with you. I think that's the way you should view it. Like, you've got your own opinions and I'm glad that you voiced them, and it's an alternate view that people need to take into consideration. So thanks for being here, mate. Shout out anything you want to shout out.
Thank you, Josh, for having me and for letting me, voice my opinion. Hopefully, I wasn't necessarily trying to sway anyone, but hopefully, if anything, it gave people a different perspective on it. So, and thanks to North too for providing, I think, like an equal, if not better, counter to my opinions. He is very eloquent, as he, would probably let us know. But yeah, I'm doing a lot of hardcore stuff. I'm really excited about the Road to Rag. If you guys don't know what that is, I think maybe even like a quick Google would help you out there, or look up the classichc.net website. That's what I'm doing. It's a ton of fun. Try it out.
Very good. And last but not least, and thanks to everyone who dropped in, by the way. I know Tito's still there. Catastrophic, Fark you, or everyone who dropped in for a chat. Thank you so much. But, last but not least, our old friend North, mate. I'm so glad to hear that you are as excited as I am for this one. There's a lot of people, I think, that went nuts for Classic and are going nuts on TBC that will have no interest in Classic Fresh. And that's totally fine. But I'm glad that you'll be along for the ride, mate. So thanks so much for sitting with us for 3 hours and doing all this. Any shout outs?
Of course. And I really appreciate you bringing me on the show. It's always, it's very much my pleasure. And it's such a fun time. I could, I've been rating this whole time, but and I really could do this for hours and hours and hours and hours. I love it. I love the people you bring on the show. I love talking with you. Duranasaur, you gave me things to really think about, right? Like, and I think you gave everyone listening things to think about and things to consider when we're talking about, right? Like what we lose when we make these changes. And I think that's such an important thing to think about. But I think it's also really important to bring optimism. I think so many people are willing to sort of dismiss Blizzard, and as even as we are, right? Like, there's no way they'd ever balance servers, and then probably not, right? But I think it's important to be optimistic. I think it's really as important, or at least not be pessimistic, right? Because I think so many people they hear the word cynicism and they mistake it for some kind of enlightened sort of stoicism in some way, and I really don't think it is. I think it's cynicism, and I think being cynical is only going to hurt you in the long term. So if I'm going to shout anything out, it's not being cynical about these things. It's trying to be and enact and pressure and embrace and push the things that you believe to be important and worthy of consideration and recognition and contemplation, because I think that what else really matters, right? Other than trying to see the world in the way that you want it to be, right? And I think that and it might be sappy talking about a video game in that context, but for me, that's really where it's enacted. That's where I see my change. And having been the player who, 2 years ago was having the same conversation on the same podcast, and I was saying, some changes, God damn it, some changes. Please, for the love of God, some changes. Sure, it took us 2 years to get there. But better late than never, right?
Very good. We've gone from stifling them in the crib to everyone love everyone. I love it. It's quite the turnaround.
You bring on Duranasaur because he's chill. You bring on me because I'll, be crying in the middle of my monologue after 30 minutes earlier having discussed how we need to smother people in their cribs. So you know what? I'm brought not for the chillness, but for the range.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Look, you go have a good night. I'll publish this one almost straight away in the next couple of hours. So give you guys something to look forward to. And, it's one of those things, like I say, don't feel like Duranosaur. It's good to get those points out there for people to consider. It's all well and good. Sit here. I stream live on Twitch and we get about, 40 of you amazing people tuning in live, listening. A handful of people will jump in the audience in Discord to chime in as well. But mate, I wouldn't be shocked if about 10,000 people will hear this when it goes to podcast form. So I'm sure they'll appreciate all of the angles on this one. So guys, look, I will love and leave you and, we'll talk to you later.